All right, so we are now in chapter 26. If you notice, in past three chapters, 24, 25, 26, is kind of going in this order: industrial, political, even economic, and now we're having agricultural, all within between 65 and the 1900s. So just remember those categories. That's how the textbook usually organizes itself in these categories and in chapters. So you can understand major events and effects according to those categories. So this is about the Great West and the agricultural. Now, the Great West, we'll talk about Native Americans, we'll talk about the railroads interaction with moving on to the West, and agricultural revolution, big changes in the West. Okay, so first, Native American history. This is really where it fits in here in this topic. Native Americans were in the way of the whites migrating into the West, right? And the Native Americans that are there are the Comanches, Apaches, Mandans, Chippewas, Cheyenne, the Sioux, the Crow, the Kiowas, the Pawnees. All these are the Native Americans that are, in a sense, in the way, and the white Americans are going to get them out of the way because they are hungry for land. They want to move out of their crowded places and to use that land for farming and making money. So people like the Cheyenne and the Sioux, they transformed themselves within just a few generations from foot traveling crop growing villagers to wide ranging nomadic traders and deadly efficient buffalo hunters. So in in these examples, the Sioux used to be crop growing villagers, and now they are nomadic people because of the horses that was introduced. Of course, a lot of Native Americans' cultures were diminished or mixed up with other Native Americans because of the diseases that the whites brought in, and it led to these results. Whites put further pressure on the steadily shrinking bison population by hunting and by grazing their own livestock. Okay, so the Native Americans were depending on these um, buffaloes and animals in the open for them to survive. Now, many times the military had encountered these Native Americans and they had to eventually strike a deal. So the federal government tried to make peace with the Plains Indians. So they signed a treaty with the chiefs of various tribes. So it's in quotation because they signed a treaty with the chiefs, and we don't even know if that chief is representing all of them or just one of them, right? So the treaties marked the beginnings of the reservation system of the West, and this is the Fort Laramie Treaty and the Fort Atkinson Treaty. This treaty basically saying that Native Americans better stay inside this circle. Before it was staying in the side of your line, and I'll stay inside of my line, this border and that border. Now it's like they drew a circle around them. The white treaty makers misunderstood both Indian government and Indian society. So Americans hope to believe that they represent all the Indians of the West, that they're all going to agree to stay in their boundaries. Well, no, they don't represent all the Indians of the West. Okay, so but the Sioux Indians, for example, in Dakota Territory, in today's Oklahoma, they placed a lot of them in these reservations. Unfortunately, regrettably, many of the federal Indian agents were corrupt, and they took the best, materials, resources that was supposed to be for the Native Americans that was given by the government, and they took it for themselves. They pocketed a lot of the money for themselves. Okay, so and also in the West, you also have these many soldiers. Buffalo soldiers were the African American ones, 1/5 of them, and they were like, in a sense, policing the West from any Native Americans that may come into conflict with them or the people. All right, so there is the military who is patrolling the West because of Native Americans who might be attacking the whites who are attempting to migrate either in their land or they're not supposed to. So there's some cases and events that are important. For example, Colonel James Shivington in Colorado, in cold blood, massacred 400 Indians. And the Indians were innocent. They thought that they'd been promised to be protected, but this colonel made a mistake, not a mistake, but killed a lot of Native Americans. So the Sioux, of course, is going to respond, and they responded by blocking the construction of the Bozeman Trail to the Montana goldfields, ambushed by Captain William J. Fetterman. He ambushed this military who was trying to protect this construction company, and this is the Battle of Bighorn. 81 soldiers were killed. George Armstrong Custer, the buckskin-clad boy general of Civil War fame, now demoted to colonel, turned Indian fighter, and he remembered writing about this event in Fetterman. So Custer is now going to remember this as like a horrible event, and he also wants revenge. So you can see this revenge is being passed back and forth with the Native Americans, and it's just going to grow. Okay, another Treaty of Fort Laramie, signed 1868. The government abandoned the Bozeman Trail. They said we're not going to, do it anymore. It's just too dangerous. So we have to just watch out for now. And so Custer is going to watch the area, and he's going to and he's going to look for reasons to attack the Sioux. And one of them is he's got to lure people to move into Sioux territory. So he announces that he had discovered gold. So many people wanted to migrate, obviously, into the Sioux territory. That's going to require the military to come in to fight them off, or so-called protect the people moving in. So around this western part of America, you have all of these Native American battles and clashes, and they're all trying to put them into these little reservations that they thought was agreed upon in this Fort Laramie and Fort Atchison Treaty. Okay, attacking what turned out to be a superior force of 2,500 armed soldiers camped along the Little Bighorn River in present-day Montana. The White Chief and Yellow Hair and his 260 officers and men were completely wiped out in 1876. So this is in Montana. It's a huge battle of Bighorn. Custer couldn't fight against all of the prepared Native Americans. Okay, Native Americans were ready for their revenge. The Nez Perce Indians also, they had a fight in where Chief Joseph. This was located towards Canada. So this fight happened, and after the Battle of Bighorn, and the Nez Perce instead were sent where they lost and betrayed, believing they would be returned to their ancestral lands in Idaho. They went to Kansas instead, where 40% of them perished from disease. The survivors were allowed to return to Idaho. So Montana and Idaho, in that region, Native Americans were supposed to be given to, this is their land mostly. Okay, in this area, here's Fort Laramie. And that's why in these places, you might think there's not much people living there. That's because it's reserved for Native Americans, and Native Americans don't want to have the land taken away. So people try to respect that and avoid living in those places. Another, the fierce Apache tribes of Arizona, New Mexico, in the Southwest. One leader named Geronimo was, they were looking for him, pursued into Mexico. Finally, the Apaches became successful farmers in Oklahoma. So all these Native Americans, when they got put into the reservation, some of them did well in terms of becoming, adjusting to the white man's way of life. Okay, so other things to talk about are the millions of buffalo, the bison. So the bison provided a lot of food, a lot of fuel, a lot of clothing for the Native Americans. And so they depended on this buffalo a lot. However, when the trains were passing through, a lot of companies hired cowboys to kill off the buffalo because these buffaloes were in the way. So sadly, terribly, these cowboys would just kill these innocent buffaloes. There were so many, 4,000 of them were killed in 18 months. So they were just used for sport. As you can see, we're going to see how much buffalo was almost extinct because of this. So the end of the trail, and now there was this movement in the late 1800s to treat the Native Americans with respect. And that was like Helen Hunt Jackson writing about how there's a moral duty that we should have with the Native Americans to treat them kindly. And their way of treating them kindly is to make them become white. Here we have an example of what's happening in a reservation. All the food is in the middle, and then they start passing it out to the families that need to survive with the food. And in these reservations, there'll be Christian reformers educating them, teaching them to give up their religion and to give up their, Indian religion, and to get the, Christianity religion, give up their practice of that ghost dance and all that stuff. Because actually these dances would provoke some prophecy that they believed that they could kick out the white people back to Europe. But every time they attempted that, they failed. Many Native Americans died. So the idea was we got to get rid of their belief system so they won't do something like that again. More strict is the Dawes Severalty Act, reflecting the forced civilization views of the reformers. The act dissolved many tribes as legal entities, wiped out tribal ownership of land, and set up individual Indian family heads with 163 acres. Now, this is very different. Native Americans do not live according to the way white people live, where this plot of acres is all theirs, and that's just that family. No, they work as a community. All of them share the land. They share the river. They share the farm. They work together. But then they're trying to forcing them to live in the Western style. They would get full title of their holdings as well as citizenship in 25 years. Probationary period was later extended, but full citizenship would be granted in 1924. So this goal was to so-called educate and civilize the Native Americans. But then it's really destroying the Native Americans' values. Okay? And then they passed the Indian Reorganization Act. The doctrine of the Dawes Act remained the cornerstone of the government's official Indian policy for nearly half a century. Of 1934, partially reversed the individualistic approach and belatedly tried to restore the tribal basis of Indian life. So they're going to try to give them back their Indian way of life eventually. But in summary, a total of 243,000 people were left. There weren't millions of Native Americans as it once was. It's a result of bullets, bottles, and bacteria or diseases that reduced them to that number. Today, the population, or in the year 2000, 1.5 million Native Americans are now in existence today, which is very, very little. Mining from dishpan. Okay, so besides Native Americans, who are these people living in the West? A lot of them would choose to live in the desert, in the dry places, because of what they're finding in these peaks, in these mining caves. And it's really the silver deposits, sometimes gold, but really silver, and then converting that silver into money. So there's these companies like Comstock Lode, Lucky Strikes, Eldorado, who would find a good mine, MINE, and dig in, and then people would live around that mine, and they would have businesses. So saloons would be there, apartments would be there, these towns would grow, and then when the mine is all dug out and then they leave, then obviously the town is dead, so it'll become a ghost town. Some ghost towns still exist. Literally, there's any ghost there. Women as well as men found opportunities. So women would be following the miners in their little towns that they would create. They would run the boarding houses. They would even work as prostitutes. Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. There's a lot of, these are many places where they had a little mining town. So the precious metals helped finance the Civil War, facilitate the building of railroads. The outpouring of silver and gold enabled the Treasury to resume the specie payments in 1879 and injected the silver issue into American politics, which we're going to see a debate on, because the exchange rate was going to be a debatable, either the silver standard or the gold standard. Of course, silver means more money in return. Choose that. Okay, beef bonanzas and the long drive. So it's about cattle and how cattle went to the rails. Longhorn cattle, Texas Longhorns, would now be shipped, and there'll be the beef barons, there's beef companies making a lot of money. Meat packers would ship these fresh products to the East Coast in the newly perfected refrigerated car. And so these cowboys would drive or lead all the thousands of cattle all the way up from the south to the middle part of America, just like in this map here. As you can see, these are the railroad lines. Now, the reason why they can't just kill it there, because there's no refrigerated car in Texas, and when you bring it there, the meat will already spoil. But in the train, they have the refrigerated car, so they would have to get cowboys, hire loyal cowboys to patiently and diligently herd them up into these train stations, and then the refrigerated car would be there, and then they would ship them to the cities to make money. So a lot of these beef barons had to trust these cowboys to do a good job. So cow towns would be formed: Dodge City, the Babylon Frontier, Abilene, Kansas, Agala, Nebraska, Cheyenne, Wyoming. Okay. So these were people, because there was this beef bonanza cattle. It's not just for America, but the whole world was eating American cattle, American steak. Okay, unfortunately, sometimes when it was winter time and it'll be below zero at times, it'll be really cold, and sometimes thousands of cattle would be freezing or starve to death, but mainly starving to death, right? Because some could last the winter. Wyoming Stock Growers Association. So now, to survive this business, the Wyoming Stock Growers Association controlled the state and its legislature so they could help to not be monopolized by the railroads. Okay. So these bow-legged knights of the saddle with their colorful trappings and cattle looting law songs became part of American folklore. Many of them, perhaps 5,000, were blacks, especially enjoyed newfound freedom in the open range. Okay, the Homestead Act of 1862. Now, this act was a way to get people to be living in the West and to develop it. So if you have $30, okay, which is probably like only $3,000, which is very cheap, you get 160 acres of land, and if you improve it, then it's all yours for just $30. So the new law was a big deal, a godsend to people in this area. So you have a percentage of public lands within each state. So public lands being sellable lands to the people, because some lands you can't sell. So 31% you could sell, but the rest of it you cannot. Either it's preserved for the Native Americans or it's for national parks. Okay, so as you can see, especially here, right, because that's supposed to be for the Native Americans. Farmers who would not afford to buy large holdings frequently proved pitifully inadequate on the rain-scarce Great Plains. But 160 acres against $10 for settlers could not live in the homesteads in 5 years. So it was very difficult to live in those regions. Perhaps 10 times more of the public domain wound up in the clutches of land-grabbing promoters than in the hands of bona fide farmers. Okay, so many people buy in to make money, not to live in it, and that was the problem. And what happens if no one buys it? Then there's a huge debt. So it's hard to develop this land. Some railroad companies induced Americans and European immigrants to buy the cheap land earlier granted to the railroads by the government. The windswept prairies were for the most part treeless, and the tough sod had been pounded solid by millions of buffalo hooves. Well, once the prairie sod was broken with heavy iron plows pulled by 4 yokes of oxen, the plow that broke the plains, the earth proved. Okay, so they are basically saying that they are just digging and digging the land, but they realize that there's some parts of America that doesn't have much water. And they're going to realize that at the 100th meridian, this imaginary line cutting down through the Dakotas down to West Texas becomes really dry, and the east of that line becomes really watered. So it was almost impossible to depend on the rain. You would have to really irrigate it, which means build waterways. Otherwise, you can't depend on the rain. It wouldn't rain so much. So you had the dry farming, and the farming would become so dry that it would lead to a dust bowl in the future, which we'll see. Okay. Tough strains of wheat resistant to cold and drought were imported from Russia and blossomed into billowing yellow carpets. So they had to also change the wheat because the ones that they were growing wasn't working well. Okay, so rivers and dams were the main things they had to control the flow in. The far west comes of age. Boomtown, Colorado, offspring of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, was greeted in 1876 as the Centennial State. North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming. These are now admitted as new states because they were coming in. Utah, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona remain to be lifted to statehood eventually. So people are looking for reasons to move into these places. Okay. The city of Guthrie. So just people just moving suddenly in these places. The fading frontier. Okay, so the government now is starting to realize we got to set aside land that shouldn't be, you know, entirely exploited of its resources. We have to leave behind some trees, some lumber, and if you don't, then it's going to be completely wiped out. So the frontier is also known as a safety valve in theory that people can move there when things get tough in the east. So thankfully, there's so much land to move to when there's issues. This is where people could run away from their economic problems. They run to the west. You can't pay debt in the east, move out, run to the west. Okay, that's what a safety valve means. There's like a safety valve in every pipe system. So when there's too much pressure, they release that safety valve to relieve the pressure. The American people made their last and most desperate struggle against colonization. The Anglo culture collided with the Hispanic culture. America faced across the Pacific, Asia. Asian Americans dwell there today in the West, East Coast, West Coast, actually. Yes. Farm becomes a factory. Now, what does this mean? So much grain is being produced because the inventions, for example, the combine, a reaper thresher is like a huge cutter of soil that's what be used. And so a lot of wheat farms were being developed. So America became the world's bread basket and butcher shop. It had all the bread to give the world and all the meat to give the world. So America was very, very rich agriculturally. This is a combine right here, combining reaper and thresher. They reap to cut and they thresh it to get the grain ready for packaging at the same time. California had to build a lot of these irrigations to build up the whole world, build up the whole part of America. Okay, of course, buying all this land and then not paying it back, people were just losing money. So you led to deflation, led to inflation, and a lot of problems. A lot of people couldn't pay back, especially farmers, unhappy farmers. Nothing but the mortgage. They were living miserable life. The bank were ready to take their land because they thought they could develop the land and make money. But then the freight rates, the railroad people are so corrupted. They make it so expensive to ship the grain. So a lot of them are just suffering in this sense. The farmers take their stand. The National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry. So they form these little organizations, kind of like a union, but like a lobby group, to get people to work together against these railroad companies who are trying to rip them off and almost make it impossible for them to ship their goods to the market to make a profit. Okay, the Farmers Alliance. Again, this is a prelude to populism. We talk about the Populist Party, and these are all what they're fighting for. Okay, they want to have a graduated income tax. Farmers that their loans can be extended, and unlimited coinage of silver so that they can keep turning in their silver for money. So farmers were kind of putting up a tough fight against the government who helped mainly the railroad companies, then the farmers. So farmers needed help. This is the Populist Party. Now, besides that, there were strikes because of unions were going against their employers, so there was some strike, and there's some sad strikes because sometimes they would attack the strikers even though it was peaceful. They would fire upon them, and that's what happened with the Coxey's Army and the Pullman strike. Okay. So Coxey's Army was known as a bunch of strikers who looked like an army getting into DC. So such a long distance travel. So it was called 500,000 strong marching. So that was Commonweal Army, Coxey's Army. Okay. But they got arrested for walking on the grass. But then the Pullman strike was a dramatic one. It was when there was the railroad union, 150,000 members, and then when their wages were cut, they were going to do a strike. But while they were doing a strike, what is that? Federal troops, bayonet sticks, crushed the Pullman strike. So there was weapons now used to stop strikes. Of course, like facing them, shooting them, really scary and dangerous. Now there's an election: McKinley, silver, William Jennings Bryan. So now people wanted silver or gold. Those who had gold could trade in their money in the. Let's say you have gold, you go into the treasury and say, "Hey, you want to get my gold? Give me cash." But which one has a higher exchange rate? There, this was the debate. William Jennings Bryan was hoping for silver to be not equal to gold, but closer to gold. So William Jennings Bryan was from Nebraska, so he was supporting many of the Western people who were for silver. But William McKinley, this William was going for gold, and so that means he was supporting the East Coast people who had a lot of gold. Okay, so the populace supported mainly William Jennings Bryan, and the William McKinley. McKinley was for the not Republicans, but yes, he was for the Republicans, but mainly East Coast people. So that's why it's plow holders versus bondholders. This was the debate. And William McKinley's going to win this election. And here's this map showing how you can see the Democrat, William Jennings Bryan, won all the farmers, and McKinley, Republican, won all the kind of like city people. So it became the gold standard. Okay, so that's about it for today. All right, class. This is chapter 27, Empire and Expansion. And this chapter is important because this chapter explains about Guam, the Pacific area. Now we know that America will expand into the Pacific. They will build bases in the Pacific, and Guam will be one of them, the Philippines, Hawaii, American Samoa. And this is what this chapter is about. So it's entitled Empire and Expansion. So here it will be very important to understand a new kind of era, a new kind of dawning of America, where now they are very strong economically, politically, and now that the Civil War has been over, and within 30, 40 years of corruption, they were attempting to fight it, to put it down in the politics. So now they could focus outward, right? And this is what their new plan is going to be. Now, if you look at the Democratic National Platform, it says here, we assert that no nation can long endure half republic and half empire. And we warn the American people that imperialism abroad will lead quickly and inevitably to despotism at home. So the Democrats knew that this is kind of fishy to go expand, okay, abroad, right? A republic means we have to give the people what they need, what's important for them. But if they're going to be expanding their country, their empire into the islands and other countries, they're not really giving those people what they want, right? So there's going to be some conflict here. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Why did America begin to look outward? Now we know that it all started really in the Manifest Destiny when they wanted to expand towards Mexico and towards California. Now that they expanded south as much as they could through the Mexican-American War, and now they expanded to as far as Washington and California, the state of Washington and California, now that they became states. Where else can they expand? Of course, they're looking towards the Pacific. They're looking even towards Asia, really because of overseas markets, right? It was based on these markets that they felt if they've expanded there, they can make America more rich. Now, a big factor was the journalists, the Yellow Press of Joseph Pulitzer and Randolph Hearst. They have all the news who are trying to stimulate the people to expand forward and outward. So you can see Uncle Sam here in this political cartoon. You will see this political cartoon many times in our AP exams. You can see this is the current president, right? Okay, William McKinley. Speaking to Uncle Sam, of course, Uncle Sam is a symbolic figure of America, and William McKinley is ready to do Uncle Sam's service. So you can see he's saying to Uncle Sam, what would you like to have? Cuban steak, Puerto Rican pig, Philippine floating islands. All of these places in the Caribbean and even in the Pacific are available for Uncle Sam's taking. What would you like to prefer? So we can see that Uncle Sam is, he's debating, how should I enjoy this right now? Okay, so let's first look at how the culture of Americans was already spreading in these Pacific places. And when we say the culture of America, it really it's an Anglo-Saxon culture and also a Christianity kind of culture that is going into these places. So the Americans felt like their Anglo-Saxon civilization is the best culture and it will help advance the backward people of those native islands and those places. So we get the Americans felt we have to give them our American culture. And another thing is America believed that this Darwinism attitude. Remember, the evolution theory says that Darwinism means the survival of the fittest. Since America is the fittest, is the strongest, they think they have a right to go to the weaker people and then establish their culture over there. Okay. So not only America is doing this, of course, there are other nations who are trying to become an expanding country, expanding their empire. This expanding empire means imperialism. That's the word. Imperialistic is a country trying to expand their power, their influence, some through forceful means, some through diplomatic ways. And even in those diplomatic ways, there was kind of like a cheating kind of thing where they would pretend to help them. But in reality, the deal was you better give us your authority for people, and then we'll give you protection, something like that. In any case, they wanted to expand their empire, their domination of their country. So we have Japan, Germany, and Russia are all doing this. Now, why would they be expanding? Like, what was there? And ultimately, it was China in the Pacific. Of course, there's many other nations too that they were getting resources from, like Africa. But as far as America, Japan, and Germany, even Russia, in Asia, it was China. China had so much money flowing into China in the Middle Ages, and because of the Silk Road and all of the money coming in, but there was not much riches coming out of China. So that's why they felt like if we could trade with China, then we could pull the money out of China. Now, there could be a bad way to do it. They could just have war with China, but then the whole world will look down upon that nation that dares to try to go to war and steals, and they would rather attack that nation, right? If they tried to do something or mess with China. So they weren't just about to do that. Okay, so how do you have a strong imperialistic nation? So Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan, he wrote a book, and this book was called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And this kind of gave an idea of how having a huge navy will make America strong. And if we could control the parts of the Pacific, the American and the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, then we could be a dominant nation. And that idea was from this captain, Alfred Thayer Mahan. So Mahan, who wrote that book, suggested let's start building a big navy, which is what they are going to start to do. Okay, so first, America's going to try to dominate their neighbors' big sister policy aimed at rallying the Latin American nations behind Uncle Sam's leadership. So America's going to try to spearhead conferences like the Pan American Conference, and they're going to try to suggest that, hey, Latin American countries, let's trade and we'll help you and protect you. But there are also other nations who would come to conflict with that, with America trying to do that with Latin America and the Pacific. And it was German. The Germans were already expanding as well in the Pacific. So we have the Samoan Islands. We know that's in the South Pacific. And America also took Samoa. So you have German Samoa and you have American Samoa. So they both were taken by imperialistic nations, right? So Samoa became under those two countries. So they kind of split in half. Okay. And also America demanded Chile because what happened is what's going to happen is 2 soldiers of America are going to die in Chile, in the port of Valparaiso. Because of these 2 soldiers who died, America will threaten Chile, hey, you better pay us for killing those 2 soldiers. Now, understand this event because this is a style that America is going to do. America is going to risk declaring war whenever a dispute is against America. If there's a country that kills a soldier, even though it could be a minor dispute, the death of one soldier, America's willing to go to war with that entire nation for that one soldier. But of course, it's rather almost like an excuse to go to war and take their country. So do not try to, offend America because they're willing to go to war if they feel offended, even if it's a minor thing. That's going to be a repetitive style that's going to happen. So at the same time, you're going to have the British also trying to take places in Latin America, and America is going to be warning against that, right? So there's all these countries are now expanding, and one thing to be watchful for, especially Germany. Okay, Germany is now expanding also as well, also powerfully at this time. They're even able to go to South Africa, right, in that region. So at the same time, Germany, you have to keep an eye on Germany. Okay, before Germany wasn't part of the the big nations like with France, Britain, and all that, but Germany now is being part of the big nations, especially because they've started to unite all their provinces together. And then by this time in the 1900s, they called themselves Germany when they united all their provinces. Okay, now another thing to know about is Hawaii. So Hawaii now comes into the picture. We know Hawaii is a state today, but how did Americans get interested in Hawaii? Well, you have to first look at the New England missionaries who came there in 1820. So there were some missionaries, mostly from a Congregationalist or Puritan sect, and they traveled as far as Hawaii and established some small settlement there, and they were living with the Hawaiians under Hawaiian rule. Okay, but as time passed, of course the New England people the Americans at that time also was able to kind of populate just a little bit and increase. And so they have to make money, right? These are children of the missionaries, just like when they migrated. And of course, the Hawaiians respected them living in this part of the island and making some business and so forth. But eventually, Japan kind of becomes a little threatening. Japan wants to expand in the Pacific, Hawaii's in the Pacific. So they make a deal with the Americans. Hey, if you give naval rights to them for Pearl Harbor, then we can protect Hawaii from the Chinese and Japanese, especially mainly the Japanese who might take Hawaii. Now, as the Hawaiians start to have some sort of business because of the Americans living there, it was the sugar business that was tending to do well. But there was a problem because Hawaii was not a territory, was not a state. They would have to ship that sugar to America with a high tariff. So it would always be a problem, right? You have Americans making the sugar in a foreign country because they are from a foreign country. The Americans have to pay a heavy tariff, a tax on those goods, even though they're American made. They're just under the authority of Hawaii. So now they're starting to take interest, like, what if we take Hawaii, right? But you have to first go through Queen Leokalani. She said Hawaii is for the Hawaiians, right? So she wasn't about to let that happen. Her husband actually, the king Kalua, he was very, very friendly with the Americans. But when the queen took over, I think when the husband died, then she was very strict, trying to protect the Hawaiian Islands. So you can see here, here's Hawaii, Japan is over here, and you have the Philippines, you have Guam here. These are the territories that America is expanding into, Germany is expanding into, Japan is expanding into. They're all becoming ready to be annexed in a sense. So a treaty of annexation, meaning that they were going to petition Hawaii to be part of the United States, but under the Democratic president, Cleveland, he said, no, this is not right. Remember, Democrats says, maybe we should not do this. It looks like we're just trying to steal Hawaii from the Hawaiians. But remember, that's a Democratic position. What would happen later if it becomes a Republican president? It'll be a totally different story. A Republican wants to expand, and that is going to happen in 1898 under McKinley's administration. Okay, now we have to understand another important part. This is also related to the Spanish-American War. There's going to be a Spanish-American War, and in short, America wins. So we have to see, how does this war happen? Okay, Cuba is a big deal. Cuba is at that time under Spanish dominance. Because Cuba is under Spanish dominance, Cubans will come to a point where they're going to kind of have a little protest for their independence, have a little revolt, because the Spanish way of doing things and governing their authority is going to kind of upset these Cubans. But America has businesses in Cuba. Okay, they have an investment of $15 million. Okay, meaning that all their sugar plantations is making profit. But the Spanish are now in trouble because there is this general who kind of did something really terrible to these Cubans, and he put them in concentration camps. And so the people of the world were all watching this, and they were going against the Spanish government, especially, again, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. And again, yellow journalism, they're going to exaggerate the news, fake news, everything. Hey, the Spanish are cruel people. We should do something about it. So the people are going to be like, hey, yeah, America, why aren't we doing something about what's going on in Cuba, our neighbor who is under threats of Spanish imperialism, So the people was kind of, clamoring for war against Spain. But it was really because of the newspaper guys, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, with their yellow journalism, exaggerating the news to get the people to do something. Okay, again, they were going to say like, oh, the Spanish minister said something bad to our president McKinley, saying that he was weak. All these things is to kind of get the American people upset. Okay, now what's really going to start a war is this: because of the Cubans revolting against the Spanish rule, Americans are gonna send a battleship to Cuba to help protect and evacuate the Americans. There are American businesses there. They're going to pick them up. Hey, let's get out of here, Americans. It's getting crazy. The Cubans are revolting, and the Spanish are, putting them in concentration camps. They don't want Americans to be caught in the middle of this. So because of that, they're going to land in Havana Harbor, right? The USS ship Maine, battleship Maine, is going to land there. And it's 260 sailors. But then suddenly, the ship blows up. Who blew up the ship that killed Americans? This ship was parked in Cuba. And so what's going to happen is they are going to blame the Spanish. And of course, the Spanish are saying, well, how do you know it's us? They have no investigation. How do you check? It's not like they were inventing scuba divers yet. They could go and check, the wreckage and see that a missile shot it. But in any case, they were all clamoring for war. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. So they were already blaming them. Okay. Eventually, McKinley will send a war message saying, "This is it. We got to go to war against Spain." And they said, "Okay, let's go have war." And it was a declaration of war. And that there's the Teller Amendment. The proviso proclaimed that to the world when the United States had overthrown Spanish rule, it would give the Cubans their freedom. So they said, "We're not going to take Cuba. Okay, we're not going to take Cuba. We promise." That's under the Teller Amendment. Okay, we're going to give them independence. So this is kind of like America saying, when we go to war and when we win, we're not going to take their island away from the Cubans. Okay, we'll see about that. So why did the ship explode? Right? Actually, in 1976, right? This is like 60 years ago. In 1976, they had an investigation. Now that we have the technology of submarines and all that, they realized that it was an accident. The ship exploded inside, internally, probably because one of the coals was near the powder, the gunpowder or whatever, and it exploded. The Spanish didn't really shoot it. No one shot it. It was just an accident. Can you imagine? They went to war against Spain by an accident. They were blaming Spain, and they didn't want to check, and they just went to war. This is why it's important to not listen to the news so quickly. There must be some agenda that they have to get the people to move the country to do something. So that's what happened in history in this case, written clearly in this textbook here. Okay, now this is another strange thing. Now we know that this is a battle between Spain and America, confined in Cuba, right? This has to be taken care of only in Cuba. However, what if they had other places to fight? America fought in the Philippines. Very, very strange, huh? Time to free the Cubans, the Americans said. All right, let's free the Cubans. Now remember, Cuba is near Florida. Let's free the Cubans. Okay, on to the Philippines. On to the Philippines. That's like way, 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 way west, thousands of miles. And we're going to fight the Spanish. Not in Cuba, but first we're going to fight them in the Philippines. Such a strange way to free Cuba by first fighting the Spanish in the Philippines. So, well, in any case, they were able to send a message to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt sent a message to Dewey saying, "Hey, get rid of the Spanish in the Philippines. Who knows? The Spanish Navy in the Philippines might come to the rescue of the Cubans so far away." So that's what they did. Dewey went into Manila Bay, or the harbor, and shot down so easily all the Spanish ships, and then sailed back to Hong Kong here, where they were currently stationed. And when they did that, a lot of Spanish immediately suffered. And also, at the same time, there was a lot of Filipinos who knew the Americans were going to help them, that they also rebelled at the same time, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, who would become the first Philippine president. And they had a rebellion, kicked out the Spanish. At the same time, Americans defeated the Navy, so it weakened the Spanish. Okay? So, we kicked out the Spanish out of the Philippines. What to do with the Philippines? So there was an impression, now that we freed them, they decided that, hey, we might as well save the Philippines. Now, while this is happening, they realized that, since Japan knows we're busy, we got to annex Hawaii before the Japanese might take advantage of our busy situation. And so what they did is they declared Hawaii to be a territory. So that's when Hawaii became its full territory in 1900, and the Hawaiian citizens became U.S. citizens because they're worried Japan might grab Hawaii. Okay, here's Emilio Aguinaldo and his followers here. You can see that they helped take out the Spanish. Now it's funny because they were thinking that they're going to get their independence with the help of America, but in fact, the Filipinos were just going to be under America again. We'll see how that goes. Now, the confused invasion of Cuba. So now you have Cuba going to be easily taken by the Americans against the Spanish. The Americans have something called the Rough Riders, who is going to get to kick out the Spanish. And also, this is where Theodore Roosevelt, future president of that time, is going to kind of rise to fame and power and in reputation. And Americans are not used to this climate, this tropical climate. This climate is going to be kind of tricky because it's not like a four-seasonal climate, right? Cuba is like Guam, right? And the soldiers are wearing wool, very, very thick clothes, and they're like sweating inside or being bitten by mosquitoes, diseases that they're not familiar with. So a lot of them are dying not because of the Spanish, but the Americans are dying because they're not used to the climate and they're getting sick. Okay, here's Theodore Roosevelt with his Rough Rider then. Okay, and now after that Cuba, they also went down to go to Puerto Rico. Okay, and they're also going to fight in Puerto Rico and take that from the Spanish. Easy. Okay, a few months later, the Spanish were kicked out of Cuba, kicked out of Puerto Rico, those two Spanish possessions. Okay, so when does Guam come in? Guam comes in here in the Treaty of Paris. Okay, now the Americans didn't have any problem with taking Guam, right? So how did Guam happen? Just remember, the Spanish had Guam. So when the Americans came in, the Spanish authorities on Guam did not know that there was a war against America. They had no idea. And so when the Americans came in, they started shooting cannonballs, and the Spanish thought, oh, this is just the tradition for saluting when people come in. It wasn't a traditional salute. It was firing at them and telling them to surrender. And then when the Americans arrived, they said, "You guys, we are at war." The Spanish governor was like, "What? We are? No one told me anything." Well, your cable was broken. Well, now you know. So the Americans just arrested all the Spanish authorities, not the local Chamorros, allowed them to just continue living, and then it would have switched to American control. So they had a deal. Spain and America signed a Treaty of Paris, and in this treaty, of Paris here, the deal was Puerto Rico and Guam will go to Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines will go to America, and America will pay for it. Okay. Now you might think, that's kind of weird. How I thought they were going to free the Filipinos, but they said this: if the Filipinos are left to govern themselves without any help, they're going to be taken over by Germany and Japan. So we might as well make America become their better. We take care of them better, or own them, instead of letting the Japanese or the Germans own them. And so McKinley said, we have to take them. And McKinley said we need to pray. Oh, he was praying for it, and he said God gave him an answer to help the Filipino people, to give them guidance, to Christianize and civilize them. Even though they were Catholics, many Filipinos were, because the Spanish forced Catholicism on Filipinos. But McKinley was a Protestant Methodist, and he wanted to give that kind of Christianity to the Filipinos. And so he said, okay, we'll take the Philippines for annexation. McKinley wanted this. Okay. Now here's the question: these territories, these possessions, can they become a state? And this is what's going to be a big talk, even on Guam and these territorial, possessions. But you know what they said? They said that if America takes this, this is like, this is causing like an unfair thing. We are going against democracy. We are not getting their consent. We're not asking them. We're just taking them. So this is actually a despotic thing. So there's this anti-imperialist league. Now, of course, these imperialists were like, no, we're going to help these natives, but really they were going to, take advantage of them. Here's Uncle Sam. See, we're trying to take care of the Cubans, the Filipinos, the Puerto Ricans, all of these, and we're going to make them our little brown brother. That's what they actually said. Okay. So America has the Philippines closer to China, big economic advantage. And so the Puerto Ricans had passed the Americans passed the Foraker Act, which granted a limited degree of citizenship, or of rights. Yeah. So these Puerto Ricans have U.S. citizenship, but they don't have self-rule, meaning they're going to send the Navy. U.S. is going to send their own governors, and same thing as Guam, to take care of them. So Puerto Rico and Guam, almost the same thing. They're going to have naval governors. But here's the question: did the Constitution follow the flag? The Puerto Ricans and Guamanians couldn't even vote, and so they asked the Congress, or a group of Puerto Ricans asked, are we citizens, or are we subjects, or are we like subjects under you? And then they passed this insular case. Badly dividing, the Supreme Court said that the flag did outrun the Constitution, and that the outdistance doctrine did not necessarily extend with full force to the new windfall. Puerto Ricans and Filipinos might be subject to American rule, but they did not enjoy all American rights. So what rights did they not enjoy? For example, they cannot even send anyone to Congress at that time. Even today, we cannot send a senator. And the senator, or the representative who was even there, cannot even vote. Okay, so we don't have any senators. We're not a state. We don't have a stepping phase to become a state. So we are actually at this position where we don't have much rights, even to vote for the president. Okay. Okay. So today, that's why there's this movement that people of Guam don't want this position. They want to be a state, or they want to be independent. But it cannot be status quo, meaning what they have now. It's a rather unfair position. Most people say they suggest statehood or independence. Either these two, just not the current situation right now. Okay. Now, what about Cuba? Remember how America says through the Teller Amendment that they are going to respect their freedom and independence. So they didn't make Cuba part of America. However, they passed this so-called Platt Amendment. And it says there are conditions to your freedom. Okay, what are these conditions to their freedom? The newly liberated Cubans were forced to agree not to conclude any treaties that might compromise their independence. Number one, do not make any treaties. Okay, Cuba. Number two, do not go into debt. Number three, America has the right to intervene with our troops to restore order. And number four, you have to give us a naval base in Cuba, which is Guantanamo in Cuba. So these are the four conditions if you want to be free. This is funny, right? If you want to be free, you have to follow these rules. That's not really freedom if you have some slave things to follow these rules. So they don't really have that. That was a Platt Amendment. It was a false idea of Cuban independence. Cubans have to follow these four things. You can't, you have to make sure you don't make any treaties unless you ask America. So still under America's permission. You can't go into debt. That's like, how can you not go into debt? And America has the right to intervene with its troops, and we have the right to put a base there. This is like almost the exact same things America needs to do when they have a territory like the Philippines, Guam. They put bases in Guam, and they cannot make treaties with other nations. So it's almost the same thing. Okay. So this is done. America expands. Wow, America goes as far as the Philippines. They stretch really far. They call it the American Lake, even, right? The Pacific is the American Lake because Guam, Philippines are taken, American Samoa, so many places. And also, this is unique because after this Spanish American War, then the North and the South, remember when there was a civil war, they were divided against each other, but now they were united. Now, is taking the Philippines going to be a good idea? Actually, America is so far spread. Yeah, you own something, but now it's your responsibility to protect it. And that's going to become the Achilles heel of America, meaning the weakness of America. That if another nation wants to take it, America's obligated to protect it. And we know that Japan's going to want to take it in World War II, and America is obligated to go out there and bring a whole bunch of navy to protect it. Little brown brother in the Philippines. Okay, so what happened here? So the Filipinos are waiting for their independence, right? They were wondering, when are we going to get our independence? In fact, they had a war. So the American and Filipinos had a war called the Philippine-American War. And what was going to happen is the Filipinos, who were promised their freedom, weren't going to get it. And because there's going to be a little conflict that's going to grow up to the Philippine-American War, meaning that two Filipinos were marching into the military base of America in the Philippines, and America tried to tell them to stop, but instead they started shooting them because they wouldn't stop marching in. So this was going to become an issue and lead to a war. Of course, the Americans are going to win against the Filipinos. 600,000 Filipinos have died in this. America now has full authority saying, well, they went to war against us. Now we are not going to give them independence for a while, at least. So they send a governor, William H. Taft, to be the governor of the Philippines, calls them Little Brown Brothers. And America is going to repair and do a lot of things for the Philippines, pouring a lot of money. Okay. The Filipinos had been forced to be educated with American education to speak English, and they're not going to get their independence until 1946, July 4. Right? So that's actually how the Filipino history comes into close relationship with America. That's how the Filipinos speak English compared to other Asian nations, because the Americans made them a territory for a while, and that's how we have Filipino migrants coming into the Philippines. Okay, so what was the advantage of having the Philippines? Well, they are closer to China. But not only America is close to China, Germany is close to China now, Russia is close to China, Japan, and all of them want China. So Secretary of State John Hay says, hey, open door notes, everyone must agree that China needs to be fairly open to all of us. People in China, no one asked them if China wants to open their doors, but all the other nations besides China, the big powers are saying, hey, open door policy, all right, everyone can share. Well, this is how the Chinese reacted. A rebellion happened called the Boxer Rebellion. Excuse me. Excuse me. So in this Boxer Rebellion, it was called Boxers because the martial arts, they didn't call it Kung Fu Rebellion because they didn't know what the name of that kind of martial art. Really, the Westerns called it the Boxer Rebellion, and unfortunately, they killed a lot of foreigners because they felt like they were taking advantage of the Chinese, which they were, and they had a huge rebellion. But they fought back when they combined all of the Western powers, including America. America sent thousands of American troops, okay, and they were able to get China to submit and pay back America. So that is what happened, and that is now the response. And now they all had to make a treaty. So now that China is so closely forced to open their doors, a lot of treaties are made to make sure that not one country, especially Japan, tries to do something illegal with China to have an unfair trade. Now, what does it mean by an unfair trade? Let's just say a Japanese goes to war in China, in this province, and then establishes their own governor, Japanese governor in Manchuria, and says, hey, all these resources are now Japan's. That would be kind of an unfair thing to do for China. That's why they said open door. Like everyone should have a fair share to China, open door. Okay. Okay, so Nine Power Treaty was one of those open door treaties, and there's several others. Now there was an election, imperialism or Bryanism. So William Bryan versus William McKinley, right? Just quickly, William McKinley is going to win. The Republican wins, but he gets killed, and so Theodore Roosevelt is now going to be the president, right? So here's a little bit of who he is. He's the youngest president in American history. Not the elected. He wasn't elected. McKinley was. He just took over because he was the vice president, and when the McKinley dies, he will become the main president. So, how did McKinley die? He was murdered, okay, by someone in Buffalo, New York, a crazy anarchist. Okay, so it's just quickly switched off. McKinley only served for a few months, and then the vice president served. Okay, so what was Theodore Roosevelt's style? Speak softly and carry a big stick. Okay, he loved to be mingled with all ranks. The president, he felt, may take any action in the general interest that is not specifically forbidden by the laws of the Constitution. Okay, so he's going to be this president who's going to now have to maintain this expansion, right? He has to take care of this. And one of the things that they always want to do is get the Panama Canal. Now, why would the Panama Canal be important? Okay, let me see if there's a map. Okay, so the reason why the Panama Canal is important is because if you don't know the map, there is an isthmus. An isthmus is a small strip of land Okay, and between two huge bodies of water. Okay, this is an isthmus. Okay, I think this is the best one. Let me just try to give you a good map that could help you understand this. Okay, so right here is Panama. Now here is an issue here. Imagine there's a navy here. They have to go all the way around to go to the Pacific. Vice versa, navy here, go all the way around to the Atlantic. It takes a long time to go around. Wastes a lot of gas, wastes a lot of time. But what if they build a waterway? They build a lake so that ships can go through easily. But they have to first ask the country who lives here. In this case, they had to go through Colombia. Panama wasn't born yet, but Colombia was a pretty big country. So this is what happened. Colombia took over Panama, and the Panamanians wanted independence from Colombia. So America says, hey, we're going to help you, Panamanians. All right. So U.S. naval forces prevented Colombian troops from crossing the isthmus to quell the uprising. So after that, they made a deal. So the new Panama Canal Company suddenly dropped the price of its holdings from 109 for 40 million. Okay, and so you have Philippe Bonal Varia, and a French company, and they are going to build this canal so that ships could come through, and Panama sells that piece of land because they helped them by to stop the Colombians from stopping the Panamanians revolution. Okay, so the Hay-Bonal-Varia Treaty in Washington, the price of the canal strip was left the same, but the zone was widened for 6 to 10 miles. The French company pocketed 40 million from the U.S. Treasury, and now Roosevelt helped the Panama nation to be born and to be separated from Colombia. Okay, so that's how they got the Panama. Now the Panama is going to be really important because now Monroe Doctrine again. Theodore Roosevelt says, "Hey, Monroe Doctrine, we have the right to protect our territory, Panama," and that's what they were going to do. And so you call that the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So um, Theodore Roosevelt is known as like a policeman, right? He has to police the Latin American countries. You can see him policing the Caribbean Sea, the receiver, the tax receiver, the debt collector. So, hey, all you Latin American nations, Santo Domingo, Cuba, Mexico, Panama, you want me to protect you? You got to pay me your fee, and I'll protect you. This is an excuse for America to make money. Okay. Preventive intervention, right? Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. This is like, remember how the Monroe Doctrine means no other nation can come to Latin America. That's a deal. This is like again happening. Now that was under Monroe, right? President Monroe. That's like 1817, very very long time ago. And again, it's happening about 100 years later, almost 100 years later, by Theodore Roosevelt himself, right? It's like Monroe Doctrine 2.0. Now Theodore Roosevelt's going to protect the, the Latin American countries. So, for example, let's say someone's going to try to kill the Cuban president and is going to give a new government in Cuba, whatever. U.S. Marines are going to land there and say, "Hey, do not mess with the order here." Okay. Now, more closer history about what's happening near Guam. Russia and Japan go to war. Now, Russia, a Western nation, also bigger than Japan, went to war. Now, really, why did they go to war? Is because both of them wanted to go to Manchuria, which is northeast of China, and Manchuria is a good place to park the navy because it's going to be warmer. But Manchuria and Korea are at these areas where Russia and Japan won. So what's going to happen is Japan is going to do a surprise attack at Russia, and the Japanese is going to win. Now, the Japanese are known for this surprise attack. They're going to pretend to be friends with the nation and try to make some treaties, and then the next day, surprise attack while you're back and your military wasn't looking. We drop bombs, and then they force them to do a quick peace treaty, or else while they're weak. So that's one of the main reasons why Russia lost to Japan. That style of fighting. And so the first serious military setback on a major European power by a non-European Japan, and Japan was now growing in power, and Japan was getting pretty proud about this. And Korea is now kind of in the middle of all this, right? So Roosevelt is going to invite the Japanese and Russian ambassadors, representatives to meet in New Hampshire and say, "Hey, let's go make a deal." So Japan was forced to drop its cash money, saying, "Hey, pay us in cash," and Russian evacuation of Sakhalin Island. And at the same time, they said, "Okay, why don't Korea go to the Japanese?" So without the Koreans even getting their permission, because the Koreans were the weaker one, the Japanese took advantage, and then they took Korea. And so the Russia says, "Okay, fine, we'll leave, and all that stuff. We'll leave the area, and now this is in Japanese control." So Theodore Roosevelt received the Nobel Peace Prize for this, but actually this is very unfair for the Koreans, especially. The Koreans were now under Japanese culture. They had to change their names into Japanese names. They were under Japanese rule for about 35 years, and they had a lot of suffering under the Japanese occupiers at that time. Okay, and if you know Korean and Japanese history, if we had Asian history, we'll talk about how many times they had to fight for their freedom until World War II happened, and the Koreans were going to be free from the Japanese. Okay, now the Japanese is growing power. That a lot of Japanese are sending people even into California. And in California, they're working the railroads, and there's even some schools that the Japanese students were getting into, but they were going through some prejudice. The schools didn't allow the Japanese to go to school, so the Japanese rebelled or protested this, and then Theodore Roosevelt signed the Gentleman's Agreement. Okay, fine, it's a misunderstanding. Okay, please do not leave America. Please send your laborers there. We'll let your kids go to school and whatnot. So they felt that the Japanese were able to, bend America a little bit again to do what they want. But what America did is he did this. Theodore Roosevelt had this great white fleet. Okay, left Virginia, 16 battleships, and they went around the world, Latin America, Hawaii, New Zealand, Australia, and then landed in Japan. Not to make war, but to say, hey, how's everyone doing? And then they signed a treaty agreement. It pledged both powers to respect each other's possessions in the Pacific and uphold the open door policy in Japan, the Ru-Takehira Agreement. Okay? No one with our possessions. I won't mess with Korea. You don't mess with the Philippines. Okay? Deal. And also the other territories, but mainly those two. And it's agreed to respect the open door in China. And we're going to realize the Japanese is going to break this, and it's going to lead to World War II. But we still have to talk about World War I. So that's going to be in the next chapter. Okay? So that'll be about it for chapter 27.
All right, class. This is chapter 28, Progressivism and the Republican Roosevelt. Now, this is such an important time because this is now a reaction to the corruption happening in the late 1800s and in the beginning of the 1900s. Slowly but surely, the people start to notice it, and the majority of the people, are beginning to protest against it. They're beginning to affect change. They're beginning to ask for workers' rights. They're beginning to make sure there's definitely equality. And this is the time for all of the workers and the bosses to now be humble, because now they cannot get away with the injustice happening to their employees. And so you're going to see a great movement happening. And we call this a progressive movement. And Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican, is actually going to fight for the people. Okay. So let's see how he's going to do this. Let's see what's going on here. What kind of corruption do we have, not only in politics, but really in these businesses? So how does it start? For example, we remember laissez-faire. Okay. Laissez-faire is the idea of just leave the business alone and they will flourish. Government, do not get involved. They try to intervene. Just leave them alone, and then they will do well. But they tried leaving the businesses alone, and what instead ended up happening was the business started to take advantage of that, and then later it led to a lot of vices and problems. And also, we got people who are taking pictures and showing what's really going on. For example, you got Jacob A. Riis, a reporter for the New York Sun, How the Other Half Lives. So he wrote a book, and it really shows a very sad look. That's what's going on with these immigrants who are migrating to America. These immigrants who are in America are actually living in these tight apartments, and there's like a family of 2 or 3 trying to squeeze in, and they're very poor, right? And so basically, they're starting to write about how the other half lives, how the actual majority of the people are suffering in these cities. Even Henry Damaris Lloyd charged headlong into the Standard Oil Company with his book Wealth Against Commonwealth, attacking how the new rich is living luxuriously while everyone else is sleeping on the floor and stuff like that. Okay, and what really influenced people at that time, especially, this is in 1890, right? At that time, Theodore Roosevelt, before he was president, he was the New York City Police Commissioner. And when he was reading the book, he saw how much injustice there was. So you can see how there's this criticism against the businesses and how the people were suffering under the businesses, meaning that they were getting paid so little, just little like that. They work 12 to 12 and they get paid crumbs, and they're suffering, they're getting injured, they have no health care and all that stuff. And yet they are willing to bear with it. Look at this. They're living in with this one room all cramped up. So many children, not much food to eat, barely any food to eat, and yet they are working so hard. Okay, socialists, many of whom are European immigrants inspired by the strong movement for state socialism in the old world, began to register appreciable strength at the ballot box. And so what would they be asking for? They wanted for these kinds of justices at the jobs. The social gospel used religious doctrine to demand better housing and living conditions for the urban poor. So it's really for the urban poor, people in the cities who are poor, especially the immigrants who moved to the cities, moved to Boston, they moved to New York, all these places, and then to live in a very cramped up tenement or an apartment. Okay, and so you're going to have a lot of people who are going to actually fight for them. We're going to try to pave the way to help them to assimilate well. And you're going to hear about Jane Addams and Lillian Wall doing these things. Okay, so raking muck with the muckraker. So what is a muckraker? Now, a muckraker is a young reporter. Okay, you ever heard the word running a muck? Muck is like dirt, right? So the reporters try to find some dirt or revealing the dirt that's in these businesses, and they will talk about it publicly, put it in their magazines, put it in their newspapers, right? And so these young reporters will do research and to show in their writings that, hey, look at what's going on with these businesses and look what's going on with the people working for these businesses. And they will even write and unmask the corrupt alliance between big businesses and government. Because really, the big businesses, they basically were bribed, or they were able to bribe the politicians. So we know that in the corrupted, the Gilded Age, that many big businesses bought the politicians, right? And so these muckrakers are going to write all these things. And so the muckrakers roasted the beef trust, the money trust, the railroad barons, and the corrupt amassing of American fortunes. Okay, so they're going to talk about all of these scandals that's going on. And so actually, this is pretty brave for these muckrakers to do, or these news people. All right, so what would they write about? Some social evils were, the ugly list included the immoral white slave, traffic in women, the rickety slums, and the appalling number of industrial accidents. So there was the white slave traffic in women, the women who are not getting paid insufficiently and unjustly, and the slums that are just so poor, bad living condition that you would automatically get sick if you live there. And also industrial accidents. Now, when there's an accident, the company wouldn't pay if you lost a leg or you got injured or you were pregnant and then the baby died because you're just breathing in all the bad smoke. They said that's up to employees are responsible for that, not the employer. So all of these things are there that are happening. Even the black people, right, who are also being taken advantage of when they were freed from slavery. And also, there's a lot of fake things. For example, there was no inspection. So if you were to sell medicine, you wouldn't be sure if it's medicine. Actually, it's just spiked with alcohol. Tastes like alcohol, but people thought, oh, there was an effect, so it must be medicine. So they were like just passing anything in manufacturing. No one knew what they were putting in there, even though they said it was Tylenol or whatever, but it wasn't even working to heal them. Okay. So muckrakers signified much about the nature of the progressive reform movement. They were long on lamentation and short on sweeping remedies. To right social wrongs, they counted on publicity and an aroused public conscience, not drastic political change. It's not to overthrow capitalism, but to cleanse it. The cure for the ills of American democracy, they earnestly believed, was more democracy. Okay, so you have to know the word progressive. It's all about reforming the cities, reforming the businesses, reforming the politics, reforming society because of any corruption or injustice. That's why we call it progressivism. If they're not getting paid enough, like $2 an hour, they're going to fight for $8 an hour. That's called a progressive move. So even today, we use the word progressive movement is basically to support the people against the rich businesses or against any corruption that their workplace or their cities are putting against them, or the government or the business is against. Now remember, government and business have high power, right? Because people are under the government and people are under the business. But if they get corrupted and become abusive and take some sort of rights away, take some sort of condition away to make it a sufferable condition for these people working under him, then the progressive movement will be like to stop whatever that injustice is, to go against it. So that is what is called the progressive reform movement. Now, this is not only like a one-time event or era. It's going to happen throughout history, even till today. Political progressivism. Okay, so let's see what is going on in the politics, the government. The progressives simultaneously saw two goals: to use state power to curb the trust and to stem the socialist threat by generally improving the common person's conditions of life and labor. Okay, two things. To make sure that the government is going to curb the power of the trust. The trust is the business. So the trust is like when a business combines together, they get really powerful. Business plus another business say, hey, let's make a contract. They get really powerful. And then they want to make sure that how to stop this power from happening against their employees. The government has to stop them by making laws against governments who might be making the people or the employees suffer. And second goal is to improve the condition of life and labor. Condition of life means the homes. You got to improve that. And second thing is the labor. Let's say they're overworking them. You have to work 18 hours a day. If you don't work 18 hours, you don't work 12 hours, we're going to fire you. That's a lot of employer power. The boss has a lot of power and against the employee, because if they don't, they could lose their job. So what is the progressives' aim? They favored the initiative so that voters could directly propose legislation themselves, thus bypassing the boss-bought state legislature. So the initiative means to initiate, right? They want to make the laws themselves instead of making the states make the laws. Because when the state makes the laws, it's never for the people. Why? Because the boss bought them. The boss is not thinking of the people. The boss, the political boss who bought the politician, is controlling them. So who are these hidden bosses in the city? They actually are the real ones controlling the politicians. So people don't trust the politicians anymore. They want to make laws themselves. So they want to create something called an initiative. and then a referendum. The device would place laws on the ballot for final approval by the people. So when a law is made, and after it's voted for, it usually is voted for by those senators and representatives in the House, in the state, and in the Congress. But a referendum is no, we want the people to give the approval. That's a referendum. And a recall is any of a faithless elected official, any official who has been bribed by a boss or a lobbyist. A lobbyist is also the ones that are sent by the bosses to bribe those politicians. Anyone who becomes a corrupted or a faithless political official, they want to pass something called a recall, where they would vote to remove the politician if the people felt that they were bought or bribed by a political boss. Again, a political boss is a hidden boss in the city that controls everything, or a lobbyist. Okay. So there's a lot of these things that they were trying to pass. There's also the secret Australian ballot, okay? Meaning like when they vote for someone, sometimes they would know who they're voting for. So they were trying to now make that secret. They were trying to stop bribery. So all of these are now being against these rich people, okay? And against the politicians who are being bought by the bosses. A big thing that changed was the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment to the Constitution approved in 1913. Okay. Now, back then, people couldn't vote for senators. Okay. But the state could vote for it. I mean, not the people, but the state legislature could have. But now they changed the law. 17th Amendment. The people will now vote for their senator. So the people could vote for the representatives in the House, but they couldn't vote for senator. But now this rule says now the people can vote for the senator. That's through the 17th Amendment. 17 senator. Okay, they sound the same. So you need to know out of 17 is for the senators, that people can vote for them now. Okay. Also, they're going to start thinking about women's suffrage, and the women are now going to start marching for their right to vote. So this is also being improved as well. And they're chanting this: taxation without representation, right? Sounds familiar. The women are paying taxes, but they're being unfairly represented. Okay, what about progressivism in the cities and states? So a lot of the companies or manufacturers own the city government, right? One example is Galveston, Texas. Okay. And when they own the city, then they manage all of the city affairs. Other commodities adopted the city manager system, designed to take politics out of the municipal administration. Okay. So basically giving more control of civic affairs to the people. Urban reformers likewise attack slumlords, juvenile delinquency, and wide open prostitution. So these are the things happening at the cities. Slumlords, like, let's say there's a leader for the homeless people, and they would tell the homeless people to do this and that, to steal whatever, and they would do it because they're homeless, right? And also, even the children or the adolescents would be doing a lot of these problems. There was prostitution, and then that of course that's illegal, and they would have police to look the other way and not to go to these red light districts to arrest the prostitutes. So there's a lot of these things happening in the cities. However, there are some people like the governor of the state, Robert M. La Follette, Fighting Bob, who would fight against the businesses. So there were starting to be some progressive governors who would support the people and go against these lumber and railroad interests, okay, to control these crooked corporations. Another one is Hiram Johnson, another governor, okay, who started to prosecute the grafters or the corruption. So in California, so that was him. Okay, Johnson was doing that. Progressive women, the settlement house movement. Even the women were, even though you might think that they were always at home, housewives or not, barely working. No, you cannot say that, because these women would form clubs and create a lot of movement, and they had some moral capacity, and they felt these immigrants who are coming in, we got to help them out. So there was these women who got out of the home, right? They were going to be fighting for the injustices in these cities. For example, keeping children out of work, because there was child labor, and they're working in these places. And also the Women's Trade Union League, the National Consumers League, the Children's Bureau, the Women's Bureau. All of these were the women were taking charge of to support, progressive laws. For example, temperance movement. Okay, the women were factories where workers toiled long hours for low wages, were a public scandal in many cities. Florence Kelly, a former resident of Jane Addams' Hull House, became the state of Illinois' first chief factory inspector and one of the nation's leading advocates for improved factory conditions. So Florence Kelly is, who was under Jane Addams' Hull House or Sullivan House, and they were going to protest for better factory conditions, and something what they wanted to have. And then now they're gonna have a case, Mueller versus Oregon, persuaded the Supreme Court to accept the constitutionality of laws protecting women workers by presenting evidence of the harmful effects of factory labor on women's weaker bodies. Okay, so women's bodies are different than men, So for example, if a woman gets pregnant and then, if they're in a factory and, the smoke and everything, they showed a case that, hey, women deserve a right to have lesser hours, or at least their working environment should be changed. The American welfare state that emerged from female activism focused more on protecting women and children than on granting benefits to everyone. Okay, so they were all about, protecting the women, and they were going to try to get that done for them. Lochner versus New York. So this case invalidated the New York law establishing a 10-hour day for bakers. So back then, bakers would work long hours, and then they said, okay, bakers can work only to 10 hours. So whoever owns the bakeries couldn't make them work long hours. Okay, so there was also a big thing that happened. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company. So what happened was, this is very sad. This shirt company, the employers locked the doors because he didn't want the employees to get out. Now back then, there was, this is against the fire code, but no one's enforcing it, right? So can you imagine if someone blocked the exit or locked the exit doors? If there's a fire, how can they escape? So unfortunately, there was a fire, right? And but the employees, because the employers, the bosses, because they locked the door, they couldn't get out. The employers didn't care; they just left. And then the people tried to go to an exit, but the exit staircase broke down. So they were trapped in the 8th floor or something, 9th story, okay, from 8 to 9, and they started to jump to their death because they didn't want to get burned in that fire. So that is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory incident, and here's the people who got burned there, and they had to get the families to identify the faces. So it was very sad. They knew that they had to do something about these bosses who were breaking the law, who weren't following the fire codes, who weren't following giving good conditions for these workers. Okay, another one is workers' compensation. For example, if a worker gets injured on the job, the worker shouldn't be the one to pay for that bill. It should be the company should pay for that bill. So that's called workman's comp, workers' compensation law. So it is illegal for the people to pay for an injury that was the fault of the company that didn't create a safe condition for them to work. Of course, the big one was alcohol, right? Usually connected to men. Men drink alcohol, and then with that, there's physical violence at the house. There's prostitution that tends to be connected, and so the women tried to create an organization to stop this. The Women's Christian Temperance Union by founder Frances E. Willard. Okay, and she would go to the saloons or the bars. Okay, and try to stop these bars. She would pray in the bar saying, hey, please take this bar away. She said, there was a lot of problems that their husbands were going to these bars. And so they were trying to pass dry laws to control, restrict, or abolish alcohol. So this is a big move. Actually, there's going to come to a point where finally, they're going to outlaw temporarily alcohol. That'll be the 18th Amendment, right? Human rum was groggy and about to be floored temporarily by the 18th Amendment. It would then be illegal to manufacture and sell alcohol, consume alcohol. Okay, so what is the plan when Theodore Roosevelt, to help these people, these middle-class people, we call this the progressive movement, the square deal. So that was his plan. That was the deal, right? Square deal. Now, remember how he says deal. It's like a plan, right? You can hear something called the New Deal. But first, you're going to hear Square Deal by Theodore Roosevelt. And his plan are the 3 C's: control corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. Okay. And so what's going to happen is they are going to, this is the 3 problems, right? Control the businesses, corporations, protect the consumers who are getting these products that could be fake, are not good products, could be a fake medicine, and also conserve the natural resources so they don't exploit everything, cut off all the trees or whatever. Okay. Now, for example, there was a strike in Pennsylvania. Okay. And they were striking, the workers were striking. Now, when they do a strike, it means that there is a pause on the labor. Now, that's how they get their boss back. Let's say the boss doesn't want to pay, then the workers say, I know, we're going to tell everyone not to work. And then if we don't work, we don't mind, and this boss cannot get money. So that's why they go on a strike. They're kind of like saying, hey, you better give us this or we're not going to work. So they asked for a 20% increase in pay and reduce the hours. But the mine owners, they said, we're not going to listen to you. We're not going to even give you or even negotiate. So what happened is Roosevelt stepped down to support the miners. And he summoned the owners, and he was so upset that he was going to grab the seat and chuck one of the bosses out the windows or throw them out the window because the bosses were so stubborn, didn't want to help them. So when Roosevelt came to prosecute the miners, to threaten them, the company made a decision. Okay, we'll give the miners a 10% increase in pay, and it will work 9 hours instead of 10. So they met them halfway. So Roosevelt urged Congress to create the new Department of Commerce and Labor to later investigate, businesses to check if they are following the rules. Okay, so these guys are going to do some trust busting. Theodore Roosevelt is the one that's going to pass a lot of these acts, right? Along with Congress, the Elkins Act. Okay, for example, it will be a fine on the railroads if they gave discounts right? Now, giving a discount is actually bad because if you give a discount to this client, but you don't give it to the other, then you're being biased. That means you're trying to help the other one fail. The Hepburn Act, if you give a free pass or you're bribed, that's also against the law. Okay. For example, if you have to pay but the other person doesn't, then that's not fair. So basically, they're trying to find the good trust and the bad trust. Okay, so what's a good business and what's a bad business? A bad trust, a bad business is something that's being corrupted, trying to destroy other businesses, giving unfair, treatment. But the whole point is to make it equal and make sure that no one is going to be taken advantage of. So Roosevelt wanted to tame the business, not get rid of the business. He wanted to tame it so that no one has an illegal advantage over another business. Okay. So Roosevelt's big stick crashed down on other giant monopolies. The Supreme Court in 1905 declared the beef trust illegal, and the heavy fist of justice fell upon monopolists controlling sugar, fertilizer, harvesters, and other key products. So there's a lot of monopolies even on these areas. Okay, so combination of businesses and integration was the problem. Okay, if you're combining a business with another business, it's becoming too powerful, and it's automatically going to kill the smaller businesses. That's what he felt was wrong. Okay, it's better to have a lot of small businesses that everyone is almost at the same pace than to combine it all like 3 or 4, and then all the 20 of them die because they were able to combine with the purpose of getting rid of the other. Okay, so again, Roosevelt wanted to tame the business. The second thing is caring for the consumer, the next C. So there was this book by Upton Sinclair entitled The Jungle, and the book describes what was going on in these slaughterhouses where they make your meat, sausages, your can of Spam, for example. They found out that the way they were making these sausages, that they put all the meat in one storage room, and then there was rats climbing all over it. Then they put that into a can, and they say, "Oh, this is just ham," and it was really gross. And in that boiling pot of food, also sometimes they would throw in a dead horse. So they would think in that boiling pot before they mashed the meat into a square to put into a can, they throw a dead horse in that was on the streets to make it look more filled. Some rats fall in there, some rope ends fall in there, some debris fall in there. There's even one that said there was even a body that fell inside, and they just cooked it anyway and potted it in the can. So the guy who wrote about what was going on is Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, because in these meat factories, it was really like a jungle. So they started to make a law, Meat Inspection Act. There'll be inspectors coming down, and they're going to check the meat's legit. They're not putting some crazy thing in it, right? So this is what these guys are doing, okay, before the meat is sold, right? Can you imagine? No one's checking no one's checking what they're putting into your meat. People just buy it and eat it. Thankfully, there's the Meat Inspection Act where they'll inspect it, right? Someone could put anything in there, just make it look like meat. Maybe 80% meat, 20% like roadkill. The Pure Food and Drug Act, also with medicine, same thing. They make sure the medicine's legit, not just to trick them like a placebo, they can believe. Okay, third C is first control the earth. Now, why is this important? Because companies can get greedy and exploit or cut up all the trees that no trees would grow anymore. And then there'd be nothing to survive. So they have to have some places that they have to reserve. The Desert Land Act, under which federal government sold arid land cheaply. And then the condition is they had to irrigate that desert. Whoever bought it has to, basically irrigate it so it could thrive. And the Forest Reserve Act also as well. The Forest Reserve, obviously, to reserve the forest so that no one will cut up all the trees. And this is the beginning of the national park system to be protected. So especially in the west side of America, they have a lot of these reserves. The Carey Act distributed federal land to the states on the condition that it be irrigated and settled. Here's a picture of John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt. The importance of conservation or the preservation movement, right? You have other dedicated conservationists, Gifford Pinchot, okay, head of the Federal Division of Forestry at Broken and Forestry Ground Reform, okay. Landmark Newlands Act of 1902, Washington was authorized to collect money from the sale of public lands in the sun-baked western states, and then on these funds to develop irrigation projects. Why is an irrigation project always mentioned here? Now, irrigation is important because if you control the water direction with an irrigation project, then a desert that receives water, you can moisten the soil, and now new vegetation can grow. That's why irrigation projects are important. Also dams, controlling the water supply so that you can send water to different places. Okay. Now, what happens if you don't have these reservations? The lumbermen had already cut off all the trees from Maine to Michigan. Now it's just from Michigan all the way down to Washington. They can cut the rest of it, and then there'll be no more trees in America, no more resources. Okay. And so they start to create clubs to teach about the importance of preserving the nature, the natural resources. Boy Scouts of America, the Sierra Club, dedicated to preserving the wilderness of the Western landscape. Now, there was a problem, the Hetchy Hetchy controversy. So there is this government, the government wanted to build in San Francisco a dam. Okay, a very high dam in Hetchy Hetchy Valley in Yosemite Park. But the conservationists persisted. There was a deep division between a conservationist and a preservationist, and there's a difference. Okay, so what is the difference between a conservationist? A conservationist wants to conserve the resources, right? And a preservationist wanted to just do not touch the resources. Now there's a difference. Okay, let's say you're a conservationist and you say, hey, we should, plant more trees, cut trees and plant. As long as we plant, preservationists will say, no, just don't touch it at all. Leave it at its natural condition. Okay, so they both believe in respecting nature, but the conservationists are more like, well, those are trees that we can still use for us. So let's not waste the nature. We're not saying we're going to cut everything. We're going to cut some of it and possibly replant some things. Okay, so there's these different views of even conserving and preserving the natural habitat. Okay, let's take a look at what's going on. So what happened is, if these companies do not get resources, it created a bank problem. If you can't get those natural resources, and you can't get wood, and you can't sell your furniture, and so that business won't profit, and then they owe the bank, and now it created a 1907 panic called the Roosevelt Panic. So the Aldrich-Vreeland Act authorized national banks to issue emergency money, and this is the beginning of the Federal Reserve Bank. Or the problem is, when banks run out of money, then the banks close, and so they realized we have to prepare backup money. The government should prepare backup money so that the banks wouldn't be closed. They always have backup money ready, so people can always be not so concerned about their money. Okay, Howard H. Taft, the Rough Brother thunders out. The Rough Rider is Theodore Roosevelt, and now he's going to pass his baby to Theodore Roosevelt's going to pass his baby to Taft, who was the former governor of the Philippines. Okay, and he's going to try to be a progressive, right? Kind of like a radical progressive. So to summarize Theodore Roosevelt's administration, he served as a political lightning rod to protect capitalism against popular indignation and against socialism, which Roosevelt regarded as ominous. Okay, he strenuously sought the middle road between unbridled individualism and paternalistic collectivism. His conservation crusade was trying to mediate between the romantic wilderness preservationists and the rapacious resource predators was probably his most typical and his most lasting achievement. Okay, this is like a summary of his administration. Several other contributions of Roosevelt lasted beyond his presidency. He first greatly enlarged the power and prestige of the presidential office and masterfully developed the technique of using the big stick of publicity as a political bludgeon. So he used his publicity, his presidency, his power to prosecute the business. Second, he helped shape the progressive movement and beyond it, the liberal reform campaigns later in the century. The Square Deal, in a sense, was the grandfather of the New Deal, which we'll talk later from his cousin FDR. Finally, to a greater degree than any of his predecessors, FDR opened the eyes of Americans to the fact that they shared the world with other nations. As a great power, they had fallen heir to responsibilities and had been seized by ambitions from which there was no escaping. So basically, Theodore Roosevelt was going to, before the people, and realize, hey, we cannot get that greedy, guys. We have to slow down. Okay, we have to think about the people, think about the land of America, and know that, we don't last forever. Okay, we got to watch ourselves. We have to have self-management, self-control. Okay, so who is this Theodore Taft now? I'm sorry. Who is Taft? Now he's coming in. He's going to become the next president, and he is going to basically try to loan money to foreign areas so that they can pay back America with interest. That's his plan. China's Manchuria was the object of Taft's most spectacular effort to inject the dollar into East Asia. So if they use money, American money, and then it'll be if money becomes one of the main currencies, especially with trade, it'll benefit America. Okay. President Taft saw the Manchurian Railway monopoly a possible strangulation of Chinese economic interests and the consequent slamming of the open door in the faces of U.S. merchants. In 1909, Secretary of State Knox proposed a group of American and foreign bankers buy the Manchurian railroads and then turn them over to China under a self-liquidating arrangement. Both Japan and Russia, unwilling to be jockeyed out of their dominant position, rejected Knox's overtures. Taft was showered with ridicule. So what does this mean? They were going to buy the railroads and give it back to the Chinese people. Sounds nice, but if they buy the railroads and if they use those American railroads, then they're going to pay American. And that means Japan and Russia are going to just make America rich. This is an unfair treatment. This goes against the open door policy. This is not fair. This is not equally open. America's trying to become the gatekeeper of this door. Even the Caribbean, now a Yankee like Washington urged Wall Street bankers to pump dollars into the financial vacuums in Honduras and Haiti to keep out foreign funds. Now, why would they not want foreign funds to go into Honduras and Haiti? Because if Honduras or Haiti borrow money from a foreign power, they're going to make that foreign power rich because they're going to pay that foreign power back with interest, with extra money. But if they borrow from America, then they're going to pay America back with interest and they'll make money. Cuba, Honduras, and Dominican Republic brought American forces to these countries to restore order and protect American investment. Nicaragua, partly fomented by American interests, resulted in the landing of 25 Marines. So what's happening is every time there's a problem, the military, U.S. military, will come into these Latin American countries in the idea of restoring order. Okay, Taft wanted to be a Roosevelt, so you start to bust businesses within 4 years. So Taft busted 9, or sued or prosecuted these businesses. He tried to be Roosevelt, but he was more than a Roosevelt. He busted too much. Some were unreasonable, and so people didn't like Taft doing this. That he was just kind of recklessly going against any business that was just making a lot of money. So it's kind of like business didn't really, think it's fair. That hey, yeah, we're not trying to be so bad. Like it's free competition. So because of Taft, the Republican Party was split up, and now guess what's going on? Taft is betraying the Republican Party. Taft signed the Payne-Aldrich bill, betraying his campaign promises and outraging the progressive wing of the party, heavily drawn from the Midwest. Okay, so he was going to not tax some things, and basically he's going to change. Okay, and so remember this: in 1908, Roosevelt takes back the take back giver. In 1912, hey, give me back my presidency. Okay, so he gave it to Taft, and now Theodore Roosevelt wants the presidency back. So there's division in the Republican Party. Okay, because there's this division in the Republican Party, there's going to be a problem that it's going to lead to a Democratic victory. Okay, so that'll be it for today. That was chapter 28. All right, guys, so here we are with chapter 29, Wilsonian progressivism at home and abroad. And so here we are starting at this new progressive movement, which actually started under Theodore Roosevelt's time. It started meaning that the president will begin to address the injustices in the workplaces, and even the Populist Party will also begin their movement with their injustices in the farmland. And we'll see what will happen with Woodrow Wilson. Now, remember that Woodrow Wilson won because the Republican Party was divided, and that was the reason why there was this win for the Democrats. Now, if they're divided, it means that this division that they had divided the votes and led to a Democrat victory. So if you have let's say if it's 50%, 25% went to the Theodore Roosevelt, or 25% went to Taft, and the other 25% went to Theodore Roosevelt. No one can be a winner. You have to have above 50. It just so happened to be Woodrow Wilson. All right, so the Democrats elected him, and his program was called New Freedom. They have all these fancy names, but the name could be confusing. So just remember that it's all to stop problems of businesses. So to help create new laws, antitrust legislation, reform the banking system, and tariff reduction. Okay, and we'll talk about how he does it and how it helps. Okay, so progressivism is starting to think about, almost imagine that the minorities, like the women or some social people of some social status who were never heard of, like who have been ignored, some middle class people and women. Now progressive meant that they're going to now stand for them. Those who have been ignored or passed by, the progressive movement will help, the women who didn't get their freedoms. That's why it's called New Freedom, and even workers getting their freedoms that they didn't have before. Okay, so that's why it says here, Roosevelt and Taft were bound to slit each other's political throats by dividing the Republican vote. They virtually guaranteed a Democratic victory. Okay, so Roosevelt's New Nationalism or Wilson's New Freedom, both men favored a more active government role in economic and social affairs, but they disagreed sharply over specific strategies. So they had their own way how they were going to help the middle class people, okay, and to stop, big businesses and their corruption, and also the corruption in the cities. Okay, Crowley and Theodore Roosevelt both favored continued consolidation of trusts and labor unions, paralleled by the growth of powerful regulatory agencies in Washington. Okay, so they're okay with as long as the businesses and the labor unions or the unions were able to come into agreement, then government won't be so involved, right? Government won't try to worry about it, okay? But they will try to do at least some of the policies, but as long as the unions are being respected, then it'll be easier. New Freedom, by contrast, Wilson's own, favored small enterprise, entrepreneurship, and free functioning of unregulated and unmonopolized markets. So small businesses is what Wilson was for than the big businesses, okay? So he wasn't about to whip the big businesses. He wanted to, as long as there's small businesses, then that's important because it's going to cause competition. So the problem is that there's only big businesses, and now they had to encourage the small business to, if they were to encourage the small business, then that would help to ease the competition. Wilson's campaign was not regulation, but fragmentation of the big industrial combines, meaning, it's better if we divide up the big ones into small ones than making them too big because they'll be too rich. Okay. So Woodrow Wilson was the winner of the election, right? For 435 electoral votes. Okay, and another candidate, he's worth mentioning. They were going to have a socialist candidate, the super left, democratic liberal for the people, Eugene V. Debs. Now, socialism is very close to communism. So, socialism is like, because the rich people, they dislike it so much, they have so much power. Socialism tries to, tax the rich a lot and to give a lot of it to the middle class and to give them some fair share of the, of the money that they have, so that it could go back to the people. And even if they didn't earn it, they'll still give it to them. Okay. So, Republicans, they were thrust into an unaccustomed minority status in Congress for the next 6 years, and were frozen out of the White House for 8 years. So this means the Democrats were in control of the House and also the presidency, right? Because Woodrow Wilson. So that means almost anything could be passed from any bill from the Congress and into the president's office, because there was no opposition party. The Republicans were the dominant ones, so it will easily pass any bill. Okay, so there will be a good time for Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson, the second Democratic president since 1861. So first, after 1861, right, you had Grover Cleveland, and then another long time later, you're going to have Woodrow Wilson. So you weren't having much Democratic presidents. So who is this guy? He's the son of a Presbyterian minister. Okay, he was persuasive. He had a persuasive voice. He relied not on arm waving, but on sincerity and moral appeal. He was a very sincere guy. He wanted to be real. He wanted to do things for moral purposes. He wasn't, trying to have any shortcuts or cheat anyone. He's very straightforward. Okay, and someone that people say he was born halfway between the Bible and the dictionary, and never strayed away from the other. He was convinced that the Congress could not function properly unless the president, like kind of a prime minister, go out in front and provide leadership. So he thought that he knew better than anyone else, that they need leadership. They need to follow his example. So he wasn't going behind that kind of leadership, like letting the Congress do things on their own, and he just follows. He wanted to be in front of them. Okay, so because of this, he was so stubborn, right? Meaning, if he felt he was right, no one could convince him otherwise. Okay, and that's because his academic background let him feel that way. He was always feeling comfortable talking with scholars, and he worked with politicians. Okay, his sense of moral righteousness was such that he often found compromise difficult. Black was black, wrong was wrong, and one should never compromise with wrong. And that's his kind of attitude that won't give in and won't let a little bit, to give way. If it was wrong, he wasn't going to budge. Okay, so what is his plan? Tackles the tariff, the triple wall of privilege, the tariff, the banks, and the trust. Okay, so once again, you have to know what a tariff is. Again, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. So when they're importing goods, items from another country, the U.S. will try to tax them, and they will get the money from them. Okay, so they would have bills. The higher the taxes, then the tariffs, the more that they can make. Okay, but if you reduce it, then you wouldn't make money, but you would make it more. America would be more attractive because it's cheap to go in. You don't have to pay much taxes. France, Britain, Spain, whatever, they can easily come into America and trade because they don't have to worry about paying such an entrance fee into America. So the force of public opinion aroused by the president's oratory secured late 1913 final approval of the bill Wilson wanted. Okay, so it reduced imported fees, and it was a big deal. Under authority granted by the recently ratified 16th Amendment, Congress enacted a graduated income tax beginning with a modest levy on incomes over $3,000. Okay, so a graduated income tax is different than a flat tax. So meaning, like, instead of saying everyone pays 3%, 10%, that's called a flat tax, right? But if a graduated means that, hey, if you make more than $300,000, you should pay more than 7%, pay 10%. That's called a graduated income. And they might think that's not fair, but let's say you're like $10 million rich and you still pay 7%. Like everyone else was making $50,000 and they pay 7%. That 7% is a lot to someone making $50,000, but 7% is so little to someone making like $10 million. So it's fair that you should tax more. Gradually increase it as they make higher salaries. So incomes over $3,000, which was a lot by that time. It's almost like $300,000. they had to pay a higher tax. Okay, Wilson battles the bankers. The antiquated and inadequate banking and currency system. So what was wrong here with the banks? First, you have to remember that banks always close because they've always lent money beyond what the people were able to pay back. Okay, and when a bank has no money, when everyone's savings that they put in that bank was loaned to someone else because they thought that no one was going to use their money, but they end up doing because they have no money in the bank, and they thought that maybe the people will pay it back and it could hopefully the people will not pull out their savings, but that didn't happen. So that was always the problem with banks. How can we save the banks from closing? Banks close when there's no money because they've loaned too much and people didn't pay back and they thought they would. So when they loaned money and people couldn't pay back, they just loaned money almost for free. So they had to solve this problem. So there was a special commission. Okay, Aldrich, the Secretary of Treasury, came up with this idea, a third bank of the United States, something like this. Okay, so here was the plan. He ringingly endorsed Democratic proposals for a decentralized bank in government hands. Okay, decentralized bank in government hands, as opposed to the Republican demands for a huge private bank with 15 branches. Now, what does this mean? So they want to create a bank, but not owned by the government. And this is the beginning of the Federal Reserve Board, the FRB. The Federal Reserve Act is going to be in place. So basically, there's going to be this reserve board, and they are not government-related positions, but the president gets to appoint them, but they'll be responsible for overseeing a nation of reserve districts. So the Federal Reserve Board will have the power to issue paper money or Federal Reserve notes. If you look at your $5 bill, your $10 bill, it says Federal Reserve note. That is paper money. So this private bank is going to be created by the government. It's kind of confusing. The public government is going to create a private bank, and it's going to be like a bank of all the banks, right? So the banks have to get money from the Federal Reserve. And the more the Federal Reserve prints, then that would cause inflation. The people would raise prices because there's more money to go around. Now, there is a catch in this. This Federal Reserve Bank is like the bank for all banks. So meaning if a bank would go out a bit of money, the Federal Reserve Bank reserves some money for those banks so they won't close down. Let's say Bank of Guam was about to close down, but the Federal Reserve bailed them out by saying, hey, we saved $250 million for you. Just in case this might have happened, you can now use it, okay, to just save yourself. Now, why would that be important? So that if they close their bank, people be upset, right? Because their money was in there. So they'll never go to that bank again. But if they put money in there from the Federal Reserve, then the people will be like, hey, our money is still there. We won't pull out all our money. The bank won't close. People can still hold on to their loans and pay them back because the bank is, still waiting for them. So it is the beginning of the FRB, right? The Federal Reserve note. So how would that help the banks? So the banks don't close. It helps to save the economy. Okay, now what about the trust? The Federal Trade Commission was created in 1914, and this new law empowered a presidentially appointed commission to turn a searchlight on industries engaged in interstate commerce, such as meat packers. The commissioners were expected to crush monopoly at the source by rooting out unfair trade practices, including unlawful competition, false advertising, mislabeling, adulteration, and bribery. Okay, so this kind of like this commission will inspect for dishonest business. It will investigate any dishonest business. Now, what's an example of dishonest business? For example, false advertising. Like, let's say they're advertising something like this medicine is cure everything, but that in fact the medicine doesn't do anything. That's false advertising. They say this costs $20, but when you go there, it costs $100. That's false advertising. Mislabeling is obvious. Let's say they're just changing the labels. Hey, it's peanut butter, but actually it's a different kind of butter. All these things, like just not being honest with your products, lying about it. They're going to check if it's real, right? So right now we don't have to worry, right? Because we know that whatever we're eating is safe. But back then there was no rules. People could do whatever they want. The companies could put anything to make you think you're okay. So that was to make sure the businesses wouldn't go out of hand. So the Federal Trade Commission was for that. How about this Clayton Antitrust Act? So it was like so any price discrimination, meaning like they give expensive prices to other people but not to a few, that would be wrong to do. And also interlocking directorates, whereby the same individuals serve as directors or supposedly competing firms. So imagine that people in their board, now a board is a set of directors who own the company because they're very rich. And the deal was that, hey, if you want to make a deal, you have to put one of my people in your board. So there were so many of the people who couldn't have a business going well because the enemy was allowed to put their directors there. And so it would kind of be, they would know all the secrets basically of the enemy business. Okay, so that was the Clayton Antitrust Act. It sought to exempt labor and agricultural organizations from antitrust prosecution while explicitly legalizing strikes and peaceful picketing. Okay. Okay. So what about progressivism at high tide? How about the farms? So how do you help the farmers? Low interest rates for the farmers. Okay. So he made credit available, so meaning that they could get loans now. Warehouse Act. Okay. Authorized loans on the security of crops. Another populist idea. So if the farmers couldn't pay a debt, they can pay with their crop. So that works, right? Let's say no one buys the crop, and you have to pay back the bank with money, but they have no money. So the populace would be upset. But now they passed the Warehouse Act, meaning the government can now own the warehouse, whatever's inside, and make money off that instead. Another Lafayette Siemens Act required decent treatment and living wage of American merchant ships. The Compensation Act of 1916, so granting federal assistance to civil service employees during the time they're disabled. The Adamson Act, an 8-hour workday for all employees on trains. So they're trying to help these guys because their bosses are cruel, making them work over 8 hours, and they are protesting to have less hours and also more pay. And if they want to work more than 8 hours, there should be a law that they should be paid overtime. So that's the Adamson Act. Okay. So there's a lot of progressive movement, meaning they're just considering the workers, the minorities, those who ignored. Even there was a Jew who was a minority, became called to the Supreme Court, okay, as a judge. Okay. So new directions in foreign policy. What about the foreign policy? Okay, what was going on with their deals and diplomacy with other nations? The Panama Canal Tolls Act of 1912. So basically, American ships, when they go through the Panama Canal, either from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean or from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean, they didn't have to pay a fee, a toll. But if Britain goes, if France goes, whoever used that Panama has to pay. So they said, that's not fair. So they said even American ships have to pay the toll. Okay. The Jones Act. This is the promise for the Philippines to give them independence as soon as they have a stable government. Like that day will come 30 years later. Is that a long time or is that pretty quick? I don't know, but it depends on how the Filipinos feel. They were suffering and some were doing well, but there wasn't much enough movement that they weren't asking for it earlier. The California legislature, still seeking to rid the Golden State of Japanese settlers, prohibited them from owning land. So they got upset. The Japanese weren't allowed to own land in America. So there was a protest. And then at Philippines, American gunners were put on around the clock alert because the Philippines could invade, or the Japanese could invade the Philippines because of this. So the Japanese were willing to invade the Philippines if America was causing some kind of trouble like that against Japan. Haiti had some political problems. Okay, the people basically ripped apart the Haitian president, and to help this political turmoil ease out, Wilson dispatched Marines in Haiti to stop the crazy protests and all the killings that was going on. So a treaty with Haiti provided U.S. supervision of finances and the police. Also, Wilson purchased from Denmark the Virgin Islands, another territory that comes in with the same status close to Guam, Marianas, and Samoa, and then the Virgin Islands comes in at this time. Okay, Puerto Rico. Okay, now a little bit about Mexico. We're gonna have some Mexican issues, and that's because Mexico goes through several revolutions, right? And one was by a dictator, General Victoriano Huerta, who was a Native American or an Indian of Mexico. And because of him, right, the way he led, it was very vicious. So a lot of people migrated to the United States. Mexicans began to migrate in the early 1900s because of General Victoriano Huerta. So when they came to the southern part of America, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, their jobs were building highways, railroads, and picking harvests, right? And then cries for intervention burst from the lips of the Americans because what was happening is Huerta was a very vicious Mexican president, murderous one. And so they wanted Woodrow Wilson to do something about it. So when he allowed American arms to flow to Huerta's principal rivals, white-bearded Carranza and the fire-branded Pancho Villa. So how is he going to stop him? He's going to sell money to his enemy. He's going to sell guns to his enemy. So they sold it to Carranza and Villa, so that he was hoping that we will replace them. We will replace Victoriano Huerta with a better leader, Carranza and Villa. But something's going to happen. Instead, it'll be only Carranza that's going to be the leader, okay? And it won't be Pancho Villa. So in order to make sure that Huerta doesn't become the leader, Congress sent a navy to the Mexican port, Veracruz. Wilson was rescued by now. So what happened is when there was the military, U.S. military there, they attacked some Americans, and so now they were going to have war with Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Now remember, they already had a war, but they would have another one again. But then Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, said, "Hey, let's go intervene. Hey, America, do not jump in with Mexico's problems. If we get Huerta to leave, then please don't jump in." So Huerta left. They ousted him, and then Carranza became the next leader. But this made Pancho Villa upset because Carranza and Pancho Villa were supposed to be teammates, but Wilson only supported Pancho Villa, so Pancho Villa was very upset. So what Pancho Villa did is 16 young American. He ruthlessly holds 16 young American mining engineers off a train through northern Mexico in January, and he killed them. He killed Americans basically. And then a month later, Villa and his followers hoped to provoke war between Wilson and Carranza. So trying to just have war between America and Mexico, and this was Pancho Villa's doing. Okay, so President Wilson is going to send a general, John J. Black Pershing, to go and find Pancho Villa. Okay, so his force of several thousand mounted troops penetrated deep into Mexico with surprise speed. They clashed with Carranza's forces and mauled the Villistas, but missed capturing Villa himself. Okay, so this was going on. America was busy trying to find the Mexican leader, Pancho Villa, who killed the Americans. And then something happens in Europe. Okay, it's the beginning of World War I. So World War I is connected to World War II. World War II is connected to the Cold War. The Cold War is connected to the war in Iraq in 1990 and the one in 2003. So this is where you have to start paying attention because it's starting to get connected to our present time. How did World War I start in Europe? So here's the problem. Austria-Hungary. Okay, I don't know if I have them here. I don't. Okay. So you have to see how it started, and let me just show you World War I map. I'm going to show you an image here so you can understand this better. So present a tab. Okay. Now look at this map here. Okay, 40 maps that explain World War I. Okay, interesting. Okay, so Austria-Hungary is here. Now, here's what happened that started World War I. Germany and Austria-Hungary were teammates. They were of the same race, but different nation, but they speak German, right? But then as they expanded, they were taking over some countries. And even these countries who were submitting under them didn't like it so much, For example, Austria-Hungary was over this area, which is a bunch of Slavic people, okay? So this is important to know because there's going to be an assassination. So a Slav region, which is today's Yugoslavia right here, and within Yugoslavia, it used to be a bigger Serbia. So this area is like the race of the Slavs, and the Slavs are also related to the Russian race, okay? So tiny Serbia has an ally with Russia, okay? Serbia has an ally with Russia. Russia is a big country. Serbia is brave because it has an ally. Now, something was as the Russian is growing, because they are now Tsar Nicholas was a president, and it's going to also help Russia to become strong. And Germany on the east is also growing strong. And Germany, it was already against Russia. They already had bad relations, so that was already there. Great Britain was also getting strong and was on the side of France. Okay, so this is the teams. Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and then Turkey and Bulgaria. They go through the title. Okay, let me share this side now. Okay, pay attention here. You can see the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey, Bulgaria, and then the Allies, France, Britain, Russia, and later Japan and Italy. So Allies versus the Central Powers here. So far, they were neutral with each other. America was neutral, didn't want to get involved in European problems. Okay, and the British enjoyed the boon of close cultural, linguistic, and economic ties with America. So just know that America and Britain are going to be good friends because of trade, right? Economic ties, and even culturally, right? Both speaking English and whatever. So we can feel that they're going to join the side of the Allies in the future, but not with Germany. Okay, now what's going on with Germany? The leader of Germany, called Kaiser Wilhelm II, seemed the embodiment of arrogant autocracy and impression of strength in Germany's ruthless strike at neutral Belgium. When a German operative in 1915 left his briefcase in New York, he knew that there was plans to sabotage, some American factories, and just because that they helped Britain. So Germany is already feeling ill-willed with America. They're not in good terms. And when you look at it, even though the allies are against the Central Powers, and America was supporting Great Britain, and so America, in the American population, there was more of British, Russian, and Italian people, right? 3.2 million, 4.5 million, 2.7 million, 2 million. So altogether, you have 13 million, and there's 10 million of Germans. Actually, almost a close tie. Okay, so they're 35% of the population. Okay, so many Americans were supporting Britain, not Germany, even financially supporting Britain. So Germany could also trade with America, but the problem is that Britain was in the middle between America and Germany, that it was hard to trade with America. The Germans were kind of like, they had a bad position, and the British had a better position to trade with America. So naturally, the Americans traded with the British. Okay, so World War I started because there was going to be a war, and they killed the Serbians killed the Austria-Hungary's Duke, right? Which is basically, the crown prince who was going to be the next in line. So there was this war. World War I was happening. It was happening, but America was neutral. So when does America jump in? Now there's something that's going to happen, because a ship is going to sink called the Lusitania, and they had 128 Americans, and the ship sank because the German submarine shot it down. Now, why did the Germans shoot a torpedo at the Lusitania? That's because it was carrying illegal ammunition supporting Britain. And so they said, if the Americans are helping the British, we're gonna shoot a torpedo and kill them. So the Germans did that, and they said, like, but then in the ship was innocent people. So you killed innocent people. You didn't have to shoot a torpedo. Okay, and then another time they shot another British ship that had Americans in it. 2 Americans were dead. And there was no warning. And also Germans torpedoed a French passenger steamer, also had Americans. So basically, whenever the Americans were going to go back and forth, because obviously there was no airplanes carrying commercial planes carrying a lot of passengers to Britain, to America, they always had to take the ships. But every time there was a ship coming into Britain, they had to run the risk of being shot by a German submarine, and the people would sink and drown. Okay, the United States would have to persuade the Allies to modify what Berlin regarded as the legal blockade. So they said that Germans are saying, well, they're passing through this war and it's illegal. They can't carry these arms. So what is America going to do? The Germans are torpedoing innocent lives here, but their justification is, well, those ships had ammunition. So Wilson doesn't do anything, remains neutral, not just for a while, and then Wilson wins the election. This is a German U-boat. U-boat means undersea boat, which means a submarine. Okay. All right. So basically, that's just the election. Woodrow Wilson wins. Okay, so that's the way it ends. But then in the next chapter, there's something that's going to trigger America to join in World War I. So those are the circumstances with Woodrow Wilson becoming president and what's going on in Europe. Okay.
All right, so here we are with Chapter 30, The War to End War. This is America's participation in World War I. Now, World War I was a very short war for America, although it was a longer war for the rest of Europe, because America just comes in at the very end. So they weren't there from the beginning. As you know, America joins in the middle of it or towards the end of it after the sinking of the Lusitania. And once they sank the Lusitania, then it really meant like a declaration of war, because the German ships already announced that there will be unrestricted submarine warfare. Without restrictions, all ships, even America's, whoever enters the war zone, the area of war. So this is happening. And the final straw was really when they were able to find a Zimmermann note, which means there was this German letter. The Foreign Secretary Zimmermann proposed a German-Mexican alliance by telling the Mexicans that if you join against America, we'll give you back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Basically all the territories that was lost during that Mexican-American War. So this was like the last straw in which America was going to go against Germany, and that was their position. So America calls 500,000 men and makes Germany the enemy. Okay, of course this is going to help Woodrow Wilson to maintain his presidency. It's also going to help the British, right? At the same time, what was happening is Russia was going through a Bolshevik revolution. And that means in Russia, Russia was against Germany, but now that Russia is now kind of like in the middle of its personal problems, now the czars or the royal family in Russia is now being torn apart, and they're replacing it with a communist kind of government. This means that Russia has no time to invest in a war. They're against the war because of the way the czars handled it, so that's why it led to this change of government. Okay, but America was once saying that they were neutral, but the truth is that British harassment of American commerce had been galling but endurable. Germany had resorted to the mass killing of civilians. So America tried to be neutral, but it was Germany who couldn't be neutral, right? Couldn't respect America's neutrality, obviously by the sinking of ships, and they thought that they were powerful enough to go on a war even without America, even with America. Okay, so Duchad, one of the most sacred of those traditions, was entangling America in a distant European war. Now, America has many times avoided a war in Europe, and now this time in World War I, they are now involved. Okay, everyone in Congress also supported to go against, Germany. Only a few voted against the war, so the Congress voted for the war. Now they had to kind of have a purpose for this war, and Wilson declared it was to make the world safe for democracy because democracy was not safe, meaning there was no democracy. So it wanted to shape this international order in Europe, especially in the modern world, because of the alliance system, because of uncontrollable imperialism. That explains what Austria-Hungary did and took over the Slavs in that region in Serbia. And so Wilson has to really kind of explain the rationale, the reason for the war, and what's going to happen afterwards. So he says these are the 14 points. Okay, this is a vision, Wilson's vision to make sure that there'll never be a war again. And so 1 to 5, and there are actually many others, this is what he says. No more secret treaties. Okay, number 1, this is what he's going to do. This is supposed to inspire people to know that he's going to change the way the world works. He's going to try to prevent war from ever happening again. He's going to propose no more secret treaties between the countries. He's going to propose freedom of the seas, appeal to the Germans as well as to the Americans. Now, back then, the war started because they were claiming that this is a war zone, this is German war zone, this is British war zone. There was no freedom of the seas. So he's saying from this point on, there'll be international waters. This is what he was suggesting here. A removal of economic barriers among nations. So there's a lot of economic barriers that help, stimulate this war, meaning that they couldn't trade with certain countries, and that's why the neutrality that they tried to do was broken. So what about we just end this economic problem, preventing the Germans from trading with America, or vice versa, or the British trading with America. So there was always this problem. And the reduction of armament burdens was gratifying to taxpayers in all countries, meaning let's reduce the race to build arms, because also they're building military costs money, and then can't we just use money for something else? An adjustment of colonial claims in the interest of both native peoples and the colonizers. Okay, so the minorities were colonized, and now they're saying let's go think about these guys and consider their positions. Okay, and the minorities, let's go let them determine themselves if they want to be governed by another country or how they choose to be governed. This is called self-determination. And then the major point, number 14, was the League of Nations. Wilson wants to propose an organization of representatives who represent the nations that they wouldn't have to resort to war, but they could resort to diplomacy if any problem would occur. So if there's anything wrong, they shouldn't just declare war or whatever. They should try to meet in this League of Nations, which is in future the United Nations. Okay, so now they're mobilizing for war. American is. Now there's some Germans, right, in America, German Americans. How do we know that we're the good guy and we're the bad guy? So there needs to be some propaganda. So the Committee of Public Information, George Creel, who led it, he would try to sell America on the war and sell the world to let them know that we are fighting on the right side. Now, why does America have to feel like they're on the right side? Now, if you think about it, Austria-Hungary's prince died. Aren't they the victims? When you think about it, aren't they the victims? Because in the previous chapter, they assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and now we are siding with the terrorists who assassinated the Franz Ferdinand. Well, if you think about it more, the assassination wouldn't have happened if they didn't take their territory. So that it just led to a whole bunch of problems. If we stopped taking their territory, then maybe no assassination would have happened. So the fault again is back at Austria-Hungary for their imperialistic ambitions. So they're going to try to end imperialism. Well, it's kind of hypocritical because wasn't America imperialistic? Shouldn't they be given back all those kinds of territories that they took? So German Americans, 8 million, and now there's a lot of persecution against German people. German Americans or Germans are being lynched, being killed. They stopped playing German music, orchestras. German classes were canceled in schools and colleges, And even if you were German under suspicion, like you're supporting Germany or you might be a spy, they passed the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act. Okay, so if there's anyone who believes or against war, like socialists would be, or even those who were trying to get people to go against America's position in the war, you could be called or accused of a spy, causing anarchy. So this is against the First Amendment, freedom of speech. People should voice if they're not for the war, they should be able to freely speak it. So they had a case, Schneck versus United States, arguing that freedom of speech could be revoked when such speech posed a clear and present danger to the nation. Okay, so they went against that, saying, nope, you cannot have freedom of speech because this is, right now we're in a position of danger. Okay. Now the nation's factories go to war, so they also have to mobilize a lot of the factories, especially the shipbuilding, and to beef up the military, raising armies and food and guns. So now they're trying to get these factories to build. Okay. What else? Even though the embattled nation could ill afford the freewheeling hit or miss chaos of the peacetime economy, Wilson succeeded in imposing some order on this economic confusion. Bernard Baruch headed the War Industries Board, okay, to make sure that there is no freewheeling, meaning that these factories wouldn't charge America big money so that it can make a lot of money by making them weapons. Okay. Now, what about the workers? The National War Labor Board was created. Make sure the employers are fair to their workers, that they would give them high wages, an 8-hour workday, all right? But if you want these two things, which is what the unions have always wanted, high wages and shorter workdays, you cannot form unions. Okay, you cannot form a union in that company to go against the employer because you already got your 8 hours and you already got high pay. And the reason why they want to do this is because why would you protest against the employer and weaken the production of war materials or war arms that might be needed for the Americans? So fortunately, Samuel Gompers, American Federation of Labor, the industrial workers of the world, were all not going to protest. Okay. Yes. Now, the IWW, Industrial Workers of the World, they did protest, but they were beaten, arrested, and run out of town. But the bigger one, AFL, they didn't protest. They respected the support of the war. So in the most heavily unionized sectors, coal mining, manufacturing, and transportation, real wages, after adjusting for inflation, had risen more than 20%. Wartime inflation threatened to eclipse war gains. Okay, so when there's war, people tend to inflate their prices because people get desperate, so these businesses could make a lot of money, right? So that's why they would be daring to do these things. And people would strike against that. Okay, more than 250,000 steel workers walk off their jobs in a bid to force their employers to recognize their right to organize. Okay, so now there's a lot of money coming in because the government's paying for these things. Workers are like, hey, we should get raises. And so, but then they're going to organize a protest, to stop working and to get what they want. If they're going to attempt to do that, then there needs to be strike breakers, okay, to stop them from striking. Unfortunately, there was a lot of riots in Chicago. Black workers, for example, who entered the steel mills in 1919 were but a fraction of the tens of thousands of Southern blacks drawn to the North in wartime by the magnet of war industry employment. So these black people went to Chicago to get some work, and they needed it desperately. But of course, black people had to struggle to get jobs. East St. Louis, Missouri, 40 blacks were dead, 9 whites were killed. There was a riot in Chicago. Population expanded to the white working class neighborhoods, and African Americans found jobs as strike breakers in meatpacking plants. So they were the ones stopping the strike. They hired the African Americans. So it was very difficult for African Americans at this time, in Chicago especially. Black and white gangs roaming the streets, killing each other. Okay, what about the women? National Women's Party. Quaker activist Alice Paul, okay, they were trying to fight for the voting, getting women to earn a role in voting, so they participated in this war. As you can see, women had to show that they were participating very well. They were nurses, and they were doing considerably well. They put wearing all the gear to help these soldiers who were getting sick. Okay. So, because of this, the 19th Amendment was passed. All American women have the right to vote now. Wilson recognized them. Women's Bureau, Department of Labor to protect women in the workplace. Shepherd-Towner Maternity Act 1921, finance instruction in maternal and infant health care. So this is just some movements for women to get into their more special programs because they have been ignored. Okay, forging a war economy. So the Food Administration, Herbert Hoover. Okay, wheatless Wednesdays, meatless Tuesdays to support the war, so there can be meat. Okay, there can be meat for the soldiers, and food for the soldiers. Even Victory Gardens, people wouldn't get They'll eat their own gardens instead of buying it from the stores. The 18th Amendment was also passed, prohibition of alcoholic drinks. Okay. So now it's going to end all the drinking of alcohol for a short time. It'll be passed back within 10 years. The Fuel Administration, Liberty Loan Drive. So all of these people trying to support the war, getting loans from the people or bonds, and raising taxes. So this is how they were going to support the war. Most citizens at the outset did not dream of sending a mighty force to France. It would continue to ship materials to the Allies, supply them with loans. Okay. Wow. And here they're building these ships very quickly. Deploring compulsion. Okay, the Draft Act. So this is basically the drafting from 18 to 45. A lot of them supported it. Some were slacking. They escaped the draft. Some were conscientious objectors, saying that it's against their religion. Some just said, okay, we'll join in, but just to be construction battalions. And the African Americans were mainly those guys who would just not be given the honor to fight in the war, but would just be in the just working as a construction battalion. Okay, so remember the Bolshevik Revolution. Now Russia withdrew from going against Germany, so that means Germany has more people to not worry to fight in the east of its country, but Germany and Austria-Hungary could not fight against France in the west. So that means the real battle is now just between France, the area of France, and Germany. Germany had counted on knocking out Britain 6 months after the declaration of unlimited warfare, but it didn't really work. No really effective American fighting force reached France until about a year after Congress declared war. So it took about a year to train the people to finally get Americans in. Now, where was Americans, missions at, right? There weren't just only in France. There were some in Belgium, Italy, and Russia. Operation Archangel, northern Russia. Wilson likewise sent nearly 10,000 troops to Siberia as part of an Allied expedition, which included more than 70,000 Japanese, to prevent Japan from getting a stranglehold on Siberia. Okay, so why would you do that? Because Austria-Hungary might go far, but then it's really to watch the Japanese before they do something illegal. Some 45,000 Czechoslovakian troops and to snatch military supplies from Bolshevik control. Okay. So here's World War I. America hammers the Hun. Okay, so America comes to support the French Marshal Foch, and they fight really in the Chateau territory. And right in the teeth of the German advance, this was a historic moment, the first significant engagement of American troops in European war. Okay, so Americans came in, 30,000. And the second battle, the Marne, September, in Saint-Mihiel and Salient, from a German dagger into France's flank. So led by Blackjack Pershing, was finally assigned to a front of 85 miles. That was his mission. Northward of the Swiss border to meet the French lines. Pershing's army undertook the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which is almost like the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, so killed and wounded 120,000, or 10% of Americans were involved. So there's some famous people. Alvin C. York, remember, he didn't want to fight, but he had no choice but to. He was a conscientious objector because of his religion, but he ended up killing 20 Germans. He actually realized he was really good at it. Okay, all right. So how did this war really end? It was really because the Germans were just tired. The Germans were tired of the way the masters handled it, and the Kaiser, who was like the emperor, fled to Holland, and he got away with it. And so people said, let's just end the war. And the Germans didn't like it. Germans were just tired of fighting. And so the United States was able to help participate in overcoming Germany. The United States contributed a lot of food, munitions, credits, oil, resources, and manpower, but not really battlefield victories. Like they had some, great strategy that the Europeans needed. The Americans only fought 2 major battles, Saint-Mihiel and then Meuse-Argonne, both in the last 2 months of the 4-year war. So you can see like Americans came in very late, right? They were still grinding away at Meuse-Argonne. They didn't really finish it off. It was the prospect of endless U.S. troop reserves rather than America's actual military performance that eventually demoralized the Germans. They knew that America has a lot of people ready to join in. They know that they're going to continue for a long time. That's why Germans were like, forget it. Let's just surrender. Okay, so now Wilson is victorious, right? Now, will his plan go through the 14 points? Did people like this? Now, Wilson was a Democrat. The Republicans are against him. So the one who was leading it was Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, Harvard PhD. And he said, this is not practical, this 14 points. Okay? So there's a lot of people against Wilson, right? The Republicans are against him, and even the Big Four, meaning the leaders of Italy, Britain, and France. Okay? In this Paris conference, they've defeated Germany and Austria-Hungary. Shouldn't they get the booty, the land, right? All the treasures and spoils from the war. But the League of Nations says, hey, you have to give it back to their people, right? The victors would not take possession of the conquered territories outright, but they would receive it as trustees of the League of Nations. For example, Syria will go to France to take care of, Iraq will go to Britain, but these guys eventually would get their own independence. That's Wilson's plan, okay? So he was trying to create a United Nations. So would this be passed? This League of Nations that, it sounds like a great idea, right? To get nations to come together in one big happy family, one circle, to talk about their problems. Okay, and they would divide that into pieces. For example, people are desperate. Britain is desperate. France is desperate. Italy is desperate to get German territory. The Star Valley had a lot of coal, but you take theirs, you take their valley, then that's in violation of, the League of Nations. That's for the minorities. That's for the Germans. So France settled for a compromise whereby the Sahara Basin would remain under the League of Nations for 15 years. France got the security treaty in which both Britain and America pledged to come to its aid in the event of another German invasion. And Italy wanted the Fiume, a valuable seaport inhabited by both Italians and Yugoslavs. Wilson insisted that it goes to Yugoslavia. Again, give it to the minorities. Okay, another struggle was Japan over China. Japan wanted China's Shandong Peninsula and the German islands of the Pacific, which the Japanese had seized during the war. But Japan had to concede it. Okay, Wilson opposed the Japanese taking of the Shandong Peninsula. Wilson was defending as much as possible the minorities for its people. Okay, Japan kept Germany's economic holdings in Shandong and pledged to return the peninsula to China at a later date. The Chinese were outraged by this imperialistic solution, while Clemenceau jeered that Wilson talked like Jesus Christ and acted like Lloyd George. Okay, what about the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles? Now, this is a very important treaty because it will lead to World War II. This treaty was basically to pay back, to get Germany and Austria-Hungary, especially Germany, to pay back the nations that were damaged, attacked by Germany and Austria-Hungary, which is Britain, France, and so forth. Wilson was forced to compromise and accept it. Okay, fine. Germany will pay you back in all these reparations, all these damages against you. So, that was the Treaty of Versailles. Just remember that was decided. And yet, isolationists came in. A lot of people said, you know what, this League of Nations, or this idea that we have to come and save Britain in the next war if someone attacks them, because if the League of Nations says one attack against one, it's against all. So America is obligated to go to war when something bad happens. So this is what the Republicans were against. Shouldn't the Congress declare war if they would like to go to war? But now if someone is attacking Europe, Britain or Germany or whatever, in France, America is obligated to come to its aid. This is what the Republicans were against. So would they vote for this? Would they pass this in the Congress? Unfortunately, it was deadlock. Okay. Other critics were especially alarmed by Article 10, the League of Nations, because it morally bound the United States to aid any member victimized by external aggression. A jealous Congress wanted to reserve itself the constitutional war-declaring power. Okay. So many Republicans went against it. The Democrats, of course, tried to follow it, but 4/5 of the Senate professed to carry the treaty with or without reservations. But the Senate approved a pact with the reservations. The entire document would be rejected. So it's either you vote for the whole thing, it says, okay, we'll vote for everything except this one, but Democrats will say, I want everything. But you ask for all or nothing. So instead, Wilson got nothing. You just cannot force, the League of Nations is a great idea, but you cannot force America to join in its war. So unfortunately, America created this pro-League and anti-League Republicans, and then a League, but not the League, and America was not part of it, although America was one that created it. So unfortunately, they don't get to have it, and Wilson doesn't become president in the next election. So it was Wilson's brainchild, his baby, to create the League of Nations, but America was not part of it. Although it was formed in Europe, there's a League of Nations, just America is not part of it. So it's pretty ironic that America created it, although they're not part of it.